The hammer fell 3 times that morning in Millbrook County, but it was the 4th strike that would echo through the valley for years to come. What started as a debt collection would become something else entirely, a test of what one woman was worth and what one man was willing to pay for her freedom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Millbrook like an unwelcome visitor, seeping through the gaps in weathered barn boards and settling in the low places where the creek had carved its patient path through town. October had arrived with a vengeance, painting the maple leaves in shades of rust and gold before sending them spiraling down to collect in the corners of porches and against the wheels of abandoned wagons. Sarah Beth Caldwell stood at her kitchen window, watching the fog roll across the pasture where her late husband's cattle once grazed. The field stretched empty now, save for the wooden fence posts that stood like grave markers in the grey dawn light. Her breath fogged the glass as she pressed her forehead against the cool pane, one hand resting on the swell of her belly beneath. Her worn cotton dress, the child moved within her, a flutter of life that seemed almost defiant in its timing. Thomas had been dead for 4 months now, caught beneath a fallen tree during the summer storms that had torn through the county like the wrath of an angry god. 4 months of watching their small ranch slowly bleed money, of creditors appearing at her door with papers that bore official seals and apologetic expressions that never quite reached their eyes. The coffee pot on the stove had long since gone cold, but Sarah Beth couldn't bring herself to care. She had stopped making fresh coffee weeks ago when she realized how quickly a pound of beans disappeared when you had nothing else to look forward to each morning. The ritual of grinding, brewing, and sipping had become a luxury she could no longer afford, like so many other small comforts that had once made their modest life feel abundant. Through the window, she could see the barn where Thomas had spent his evenings repairing harnesses and sharpening tools. The double doors hung slightly ajar, revealing the darkness within. She had stopped going inside after the funeral, unable to bear the sight of his workbench still scattered with half-finished projects. His coffee mug still sat where he had left it that final morning, a ring of brown residue staining the bottom like a memory that refused to fade. The town of Millbrook had been carved from the wilderness 20 years prior by men who believed in the promise of open land and honest work. Main Street ran straight as a rifle shot from the train depot to the white-steepled church, lined with establishments that served the needs of farmers, ranchers, and the occasional traveling merchant. Peterson's General Store anchored the East End, its wooden floors creaking under the weight of flour sacks and seed barrels. The Millbrook Bank stood opposite, its brick facade lending an air of permanence to a community that sometimes felt as temporary as morning dew. Between these pillars of commerce, life moved at the measured pace of rural necessity. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh swept her boarding house steps each dawn, the bristles of her broom scraping against wood in a rhythm as reliable as the church bells. Her boarders, mostly single men who worked the surrounding ranches, ate their meals in communal silence, heads bent over plates of beans and cornbread while she served with efficient warmth. The barbershop, run by old German Emil Kruger, served as much as a gathering place for local gossip as it did for haircuts and shaves. Emil's thick accent colored every story he told, and his stories were legendary. He claimed to have cut hair for outlaws and politicians alike during his years in the territorial capital, though the truth of these tales grew more flexible with each telling. What never changed was his precision with a straight razor, and his discretion when men spoke of troubles they couldn't share with their wives. Dr. Margaret Henley had arrived in Millbrook the previous spring, the first female physician the town had ever seen. Her medical bag and stern demeanor had initially met with skepticism from men who weren't sure a woman could set bones or deliver babies as well as old Doc Morrison had before his retirement. But when the summer fever swept through the settlement, claiming 3 children before she managed to contain it, even the most stubborn critics had to acknowledge her skill. She rented rooms above the bank and maintained her practice in a converted storefront, her shingle hanging beside a sign that read, "All welcome payment arrangements considered." The social fabric of Millbrook was woven from threads of mutual dependence and careful hierarchy. The banker, Jonathan Harwick, sat at the apex by virtue of his control over loans and mortgages. Below him, the successful ranchers like Marcus, Thornfield commanded respect through land ownership and cattle herds. Shopkeepers, craftsmen, and smaller farmers formed the solid middle, while hired hands, drifters, and widows occupied the margins of respectability. Church attendance on Sundays was less about spiritual devotion than social obligation. Reverend Samuel Pierce delivered sermons that rarely challenged his congregation too deeply, understanding that people who worked 6 days under the harsh sun and unforgiving weather needed comfort more than confrontation. The sanctuary's pine pews had been worn smooth by years of Sunday best and work clothes alike, and the collection plate passed with modest contributions from folk who counted every penny. The railroad had brought prosperity to Millbrook, connecting the isolated community to markets in Denver and beyond. Twice weekly, the westbound train wheezed to a stop at the depot, disgorging passengers, mail, and goods while taking on cattle, grain, and the occasional resident seeking opportunities in larger towns. The station master, a precise man named Walter Finch, maintained the schedules with military punctuality and knew the comings and goings of every soul in the county. Seasonal rhythms governed everything. Spring brought calving season and the urgent work of planting. Summer meant long days of haying, mending fence, and fighting the constant threat of prairie fires. Fall ushered in harvest time, cattle drives, and the preparation for winter's isolation. Winter itself was a test of endurance, when the community drew inward and survival depended on the preparations made during warmer months. Women in Millbrook lived lives circumscribed by convention and necessity. They managed households, raised children, and contributed to family enterprises through garden produce, egg money, and seamstress work. A few, like Dr. Henley, had carved out independent roles, but most found their security through marriage and motherhood. Widowhood brought vulnerability that could quickly become destitution without family support or careful planning. The general store served as the unofficial center of information exchange. Martha Peterson, who ran the establishment with her husband, Robert, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of who owed money to whom, which families were struggling, and which young people were courting. Her sympathetic ear and discreet tongue made her a confidant to women who had nowhere else to turn when troubles mounted beyond their ability to manage alone. Saturday nights brought modest entertainment to Main Street. The Silver Dollar Saloon, run by a former cavalry sergeant named Buck Morrison, provided whiskey, beer, and card games to men seeking relief from the week's labors. Morrison maintained strict rules about conduct, ejecting troublemakers with the same efficiency he had once used to maintain discipline among soldiers. His establishment was rough but not dangerous, a place where a man could drink away his sorrows without fear of waking up robbed or beaten. Legal matters in Millbrook were handled by Judge Harrison Blackwood, who traveled a circuit that included 5 counties. He arrived monthly to hear cases, settle disputes, and oversee the administrative requirements of frontier justice. His visits were announced by the posting of notices at the bank and general store, and his temporary courtroom was usually the church sanctuary or the schoolhouse. Depending on the season and availability, the county sheriff, a weathered man named Daniel Cray, maintained order through a combination of diplomacy and demonstrated competence with firearms. He had served in that capacity for 8 years, surviving 2 election challenges and 1 attempt at assassination by a cattle rustler, he had tracked across 3 states. His deputies were part-time volunteers, respected men who could be relied upon to maintain peace during Saturday night revelries or assist with the occasional manhunt. Economic relationships in Millbrook were complex webs of credit, barter, and mutual assistance. Few residents dealt entirely in cash, instead trading labor for goods, produce for services, and promises for immediate necessities. The bank's ledgers recorded these transactions in careful script, but the real economy operated on handshakes, reputation, and the unspoken understanding that today's benefactor might be tomorrow's debtor. Credit at the general store was extended based on character assessments that took into account family history, work ethic, and community standing. A man's word carried value that could be measured in dollars and cents, while a woman's credit often depended on her husband's reputation or her family's standing. Widows occupied a precarious position in this system, their worthiness determined by the estate their husbands left behind and their own ability to generate income. Seasonal. Workers drifted through Millbrook following the rhythms of agricultural labor. During harvest time, additional hands appeared from nowhere, worked for wages and meals, then disappeared like smoke when the work was finished. Some were reliable men known to local employers, returning year after year to perform familiar tasks. Others were strangers, evaluated quickly for trustworthiness and capability before being hired or turned away. The social calendar revolved around practical necessities disguised as community events. Barn raisings brought neighbors together to accomplish tasks too large for individual families, while providing opportunities for young people to court under parental supervision. Harvest festivals celebrated the completion of essential work while allowing residents to display their skills in cooking, crafts, and animal husbandry. Church socials served as informal business meetings where deals were struck and information exchanged over shared meals. Children in Millbrook attended school when agricultural demands permitted, learning reading, writing, and arithmetic from Miss Eleanor Whitman, a spinster from Ohio who had arrived 2 years prior with ambitious plans for education reform. Her one-room schoolhouse served students ranging from 6 to 16, when older students weren't needed for farm work. She boarded with different families throughout the year, payment for her teaching services that the cash-poor community could manage. Medical care remained primitive despite Dr. Henley's modern training. Serious injuries or illnesses often meant death, while childbirth carried risks that claimed mothers and babies with heartbreaking regularity. Folk remedies passed down through generations competed with scientific medicine, and success was often attributed to prayer as much as treatment. The nearest hospital was 2 days' journey by wagon, making Dr. Henley's presence literally a matter of life and death for the community. Transportation beyond Millbrook required careful planning and considerable expense. The railroad provided scheduled service, but tickets cost money that many residents didn't have. Wagon travel was slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous during bad weather. Most residents rarely ventured beyond the county boundaries, making Millbrook their entire world. For years at a time, news from the outside world arrived sporadically through newspapers, letters, and travelers' tales. Political events, economic changes, and social movements that shaped the nation often reached Millbrook weeks or months after their occurrence, filtered through multiple retellings that sometimes bore little resemblance to actual events. This isolation created a community that was simultaneously self-reliant and vulnerable to outside forces beyond its control or understanding. As autumn deepened, the approaching winter cast its shadow over every decision and conversation. Firewood needed splitting and stacking, root cellars required filling with preserved foods, livestock needed shelter and fodder, Families assessed their resources and made hard choices about what they could afford and what they might have to do without. For some, like Sarah Beth Caldwell, these calculations had already revealed the impossible mathematics of survival. The Caldwell Ranch sat 3 miles east of town, accessible by a dirt road that turned to mud with the first rain and dust with the first dry wind. Thomas had chosen the location for its water access, where Willow Creek carved a gentle curve through grazing land that stayed green longer than most. The house he had built was modest but solid, constructed from local pine, with a stone foundation that had taken him 2 summers to complete. A wide front porch faced south to catch the winter sun, its roof supported by posts he had carved with simple geometric patterns during the long evenings of their first winter together. Sarah Beth had been Sarah Beth Morrison then, daughter of Buck Morrison, who ran the Silver Dollar Saloon. Her mother had died of consumption when Sarah Beth was 12, leaving her to help her father manage the establishment while other girls her age were learning embroidery and deportment from their mothers. She had grown up listening to men's stories, learning to judge character by the way a person treated those who served them, developing an intuition for danger that had served her well in a frontier community where appearances were often deceived. Thomas Caldwell had appeared in Millbrook on a spring day 3 years prior, leading a small herd of cattle and carrying a letter of introduction from a banker in Colorado Springs. He was a quiet man with steady hands and careful eyes, 28 years old and looking to establish himself as an independent rancher. Unlike many young men who drifted through frontier towns, Thomas had money enough to purchase land outright, and the practical knowledge to make it productive. Their courtship had been conducted under her father's watchful supervision, following the unwritten protocols that governed such matters in small communities. Thomas would arrive at the saloon after its evening customers had departed, sitting at the bar while Sarah Beth finished cleaning glasses and wiping tables. They talked about books they had read, places they had seen, dreams they carried for the future. He spoke of building a ranch that could support a family, while she shared her hopes of creating a home where children could grow up safely. The wedding had been held in the church on a September morning when the aspen leaves were just beginning to turn gold. Reverend Pierce had performed the ceremony before a congregation that included most of the town's residents, followed by a celebration at the church hall where the women had prepared a feast from their garden's late harvest. Sarah Beth had worn her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit her taller frame. Thomas had stood beside her in a new suit ordered specially from Denver, his hands steady as he placed the ring on her finger. Their first year of marriage had been filled with the exhausting joy of building something together. Thomas worked from dawn to dusk, expanding the ranch's infrastructure, while Sarah Beth transformed the house into a home. She planted a kitchen garden behind the house, establishing beds for vegetables and herbs that would provide food and medicine for their growing household. Inside, she arranged furniture that Thomas had crafted during winter evenings, simple pieces made from local wood that fit their modest circumstances and practical needs. The ranch had prospered under Thomas's careful management. His cattle were healthy and well-fed. His land showed the results of thoughtful stewardship, and his reputation for honest dealing had brought him opportunities to expand his operations. Local ranchers began seeking his advice on breeding decisions and grazing strategies, recognizing a man who understood the delicate balance between immediate profit and long-term sustainability. When Sarah Beth had discovered she was expecting their first child, the news had filled them both with quiet satisfaction. They were prepared for the responsibility, financially stable and emotionally ready to expand their family. Thomas had begun work on a cradle during the winter evenings, carving intricate patterns into the headboard that would catch the light from the fireplace. Sarah Beth had started collecting fabric pieces for quilts and baby clothes, trading eggs and garden produce for materials she couldn't afford to purchase with cash. The accident had destroyed their carefully constructed future in a single afternoon. Thomas had been clearing fallen timber from the north pasture, work that needed completion before winter made the task impossible. A massive oak, weakened by lightning strike during the summer storms, had shifted as he worked beneath it. The tree had crushed him instantly, according to Sheriff Cray, who had found the body when Thomas failed to return home that evening. The funeral had drawn mourners from throughout the county, testament to the respect Thomas had earned in his brief time in Millbrook. Men who rarely entered the church filled the pews, their faces reflecting the understanding that any of them could meet the same fate in a country where danger lurked in everyday tasks. Women had brought food and comfort, staying with Sarah Beth through the first terrible days when grief made simple survival seem impossible. The financial reality of widowhood had revealed itself gradually, like a wound that appeared minor until the bleeding wouldn't stop. Thomas had been current on all his obligations at the time of his death, but those obligations hadn't disappeared with him. The bank held a mortgage on the ranch that required monthly payments regardless of whether the primary earner was alive. To make them, feed stores and equipment suppliers expected payment for goods delivered, even if the man who had ordered them was buried in the church cemetery. Insurance existed but was expensive and often unreliable, particularly for small ranches operating on narrow margins. Thomas had carried a modest policy that covered the funeral expenses and little more. The ranch itself had value, but only if someone could be found willing to purchase it at a fair price, and the current economic conditions made such buyers scarce. Cattle represented the most liquid asset, but selling them would eliminate the ranch's primary source of income. Sarah Beth had tried to manage the ranch operations herself, rising before dawn to feed livestock and check fences, working until exhaustion forced her to rest. But pregnancy limited her physical capabilities, while grief clouded her judgment on business decisions. The hired man who had worked for Thomas couldn't be retained without wages she couldn't afford to pay. Neighbors offered help during critical periods, but their own operations demanded most of their time and energy. The creditors had been patient initially, understanding that settling an estate took time and that a pregnant widow deserved compassion. But patience had its limits when bills came due and cash was needed to meet their own obligations. Banker Harwick had visited the ranch twice, the second time accompanied by Sheriff Cray, to discuss payment schedules and possible solutions to mounting debts. Dr. Henley had examined Sarah Beth regularly throughout her pregnancy, accepting eggs and garden produce as payment when cash wasn't available. The physician had expressed concern about the stress Sarah Beth was enduring, warning that worry and overwork could threaten both mother and child. But medical advice meant little when basic survival was at stake, and Sarah Beth continued pushing herself beyond reasonable limits because stopping meant losing everything Thomas had worked to build. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The general store had extended credit for necessities like flour, sugar, and kerosene, but Martha Peterson was also a businesswoman who couldn't afford to carry accounts indefinitely. Other merchants had been less accommodating, demanding immediate payment for goods and services. The blacksmith refused to shoe her horse without cash in advance. The grain supplier would only deliver feed on payment terms that were impossible to meet. Local women had rallied around Sarah Beth with the kind of practical support that characterized frontier communities. They brought meals during her most difficult days, helped with household chores that had become overwhelming, and provided companionship that eased the isolation of her situation. But their assistance couldn't address the fundamental problem. of insufficient income to meet fixed expenses. The approaching winter added urgency to decisions that had been postponed as long as possible. Heating the house would require more firewood than she could cut herself. Feeding livestock through the cold months demanded hay and grain stores that hadn't been accumulated. Basic supplies like flour, coffee, and lamp oil would be needed in quantities that exceeded her ability to purchase. Without dramatic action, she would face winter as a pregnant woman alone in an isolated ranch with insufficient resources for survival. The notice had appeared on the courthouse door on a Tuesday morning in early October, its official language, making stark what everyone in Millbrook already understood. The Caldwell Ranch would be sold at public auction to satisfy outstanding debts, with the sale scheduled for the first Saturday of November. Any personal property not exempt under territorial law would also be included in the proceedings, creating a complete liquidation of everything Thomas had built and everything Sarah Beth had left. The morning of November 7th dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every flaw visible, every shadow sharp as a blade. Sarah Beth woke before sunrise in the bed she had shared with Thomas, her body heavy with the child that would arrive within weeks. The house felt different, now, stripped of most furnishings that had been moved to the courthouse square for the auction. Only the bed, a single chair, and her mother's old trunk remained, items protected by territorial law from creditor seizure. She dressed slowly in the only good dress she still owned, a dark blue wool that had been let out twice to accommodate her pregnancy. The fabric stretched tight across her belly, and she had to leave the top buttons undone, covering the gap with a shawl that had belonged to Thomas's mother. Her fingers trembled as she tried to braid her dark brown hair, finally settling for a simple knot at the base of her neck when the intricate style she had attempted twice fell apart. The walk to town took longer than usual, her swollen feet aching in boots that no longer fit properly. November cold bit at her face and hands, and the baby moved restlessly inside her as if sensing her distress. She paused twice to rest, leaning against fence posts while catching her breath and trying to summon courage for what lay ahead. Millbrooks. Main Street bustled with activity unusual for a Saturday morning. Wagons lined both sides of the thoroughfare, their owners having arrived early to secure good positions for viewing the proceedings. Men clustered in groups, speaking in the hushed tones reserved for discussing other people's misfortunes. Women peered from storefront windows and second-story rooms, their faces reflecting mixtures of sympathy and curiosity that made Sarah Beth feel like a specimen under examination. The courthouse steps had been transformed into an impromptu auction platform, with items from the Caldwell Ranch arranged in lots for easier bidding. Thomas's tools lay sorted by function, carpentry implements in one pile, ranching equipment in another. Her kitchen goods occupied a corner of the courthouse lawn, looking forlorn and inadequate in the harsh morning light. The furniture Thomas had crafted with such care was stacked haphazardly, showing chips and scratches from hasty transportation. Judge Blackwood had arrived on the morning train, his black suit and stern demeanor lending official gravity to the proceedings. He consulted frequently with banker Harwick, their conversation punctuated by gestures toward various lots of goods and occasional glances at legal documents. Sheriff Cray stood nearby, his hand resting casually on his sidearm, ready to maintain order if the crowd became unruly. The auctioneer was a professional brought in from Denver, a heavy-set man named Cornelius Patch, who possessed the rapid-fire, speaking ability and commanding presence necessary for his trade. He surveyed the assembled goods with practiced eyes, mentally calculating probable values and identifying items likely to generate competitive bidding. His assistant, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, prepared the record books that would document each sale. Sarah Beth found herself assigned a chair near the courthouse steps, positioned where potential bidders could see her clearly. The arrangement made her feel like part of the merchandise displayed for inspection alongside Thomas's possessions. Dr. Henley approached and offered to check her condition, but Sarah Beth declined with a shake of her head. She wanted no special attention that might emphasize her vulnerability to the gathered crowd. Local residents filled the spaces between wagons and around the courthouse square, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that attended such events. Some showed genuine sympathy for Sarah Beth's plight, understanding that economic disaster could strike any family without warning. Others displayed the morbid fascination that drew people to witness others' downfalls, finding entertainment in misfortune that didn't touch their own lives. The bidding began with smaller items, kitchen utensils, hand tools, household goods that individual families might need or want. Prices started low and remained modest, reflecting both the limited cash available in the community and the reluctance of neighbors to profit excessively from Sarah Beth's distress. Martha Peterson bid on preserving jars, paying slightly more than their actual value in a gesture of support disguised as commerce. As the morning progressed, larger items came up for auction. Thomas's workbench was sold to Emil Kruger, who nodded respectfully toward Sarah Beth as he claimed his purchase. The dining table and chairs went to a family from outside town, strangers who had no emotional connection to the pieces and bid based purely on practical need. Each sale felt like watching pieces of her life distributed among people who could never understand their true significance. The ranch itself would be auctioned last, after all personal property had been disposed of. But everyone present understood that the land sale was the real purpose of the gathering, the event that would determine whether Sarah Beth's debts could be satisfied and what, if anything, might remain for her survival. Banker Harwick had already confirmed that several parties had expressed interest in the property, though he declined to identify potential buyers or indicate expected prices. Dr. Henley moved through the crowd, monitoring Sarah Beth's condition with professional discretion. The physician had witnessed enough difficult births to recognize the signs of a woman approaching labor, and the stress of watching her home dismantled piece by piece could trigger premature delivery. She positioned herself where she could intervene, quickly, if necessary, her medical bag ready for emergency use. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air enough to make standing in the crowd uncomfortable for those wearing heavy coats. Dust kicked up by numerous feet and wagon wheels created a haze that made eyes water and throats scratch. Children grew restless and were hushed by parents who understood this was serious adult business requiring respectful attention. Reverend Pierce arrived late, having spent the morning with a parishioner's sick child. He surveyed the scene with visible distress, clearly uncomfortable with the spectacle of a pregnant widow's possessions being scattered to the winds. His presence added moral weight to the proceedings, reminding those present that their community's character was being tested by how they treated its most vulnerable members. As personal property sales neared completion, attention turned toward the main event. Auctioneer Patch consulted his papers and announced that the Caldwell Ranch would be offered as a complete unit: house, outbuildings, livestock, and 160 acres of grazing land with water rights to Willow Creek. The description made the property sound substantial and valuable, though everyone present knew its worth was compromised by the debts that necessitated its sale. 3 serious bidders emerged from the crowd as the ranch auction began. Jonathan Harwick bid on behalf of the bank, seeking to recover the institution's loans through direct ownership. Marcus Thornfield, the area's most successful rancher, showed interest in expanding his operations by absorbing the Caldwell property. A third man, unknown to most residents, had arrived that morning and stood apart from the crowd, studying the proceedings with intense attention. The stranger was tall and lean, dressed in expensive but practical clothing that suggested wealth. Without ostentation, His hat was well made but worn, his boots showed the wear of actual ranch work, and his horse, a magnificent black stallion tied near the depot, indicated both means and excellent judgment in livestock. He spoke to no one, made no inquiries about the property, and seemed to observe everything with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for exactly the right moment. Bidding opened at $500, a sum that represented serious money. In Millbrook's economy, Banker Harwick raised it immediately to $600, establishing the bank's determination to protect its interests. Marcus Thornfield countered at $700, his bid reflecting both financial capability and strategic thinking about property consolidation. The unknown man remained silent, watching the early exchanges without revealing his intentions. As prices climbed past $800, the crowd grew more attentive. This was real money being discussed, amounts that represented years of labor for most families present. Sarah Beth watched each bid with careful attention, understanding that higher prices improved her chances of having something left after debts were satisfied, but also knowing that she was witnessing the final dissolution of everything she and Thomas had built together. The banker and Thornfield continued their competition past $900, their bids becoming more cautious as they approached the limits of prudent investment. Property values in the region were difficult to assess accurately, and overpaying for land could create financial problems for even successful businessmen. The unknown man continued his silent observation, occasionally glancing at Sarah Beth with an expression she couldn't interpret. At $1,000, Banker Harwick hesitated before making his next bid. The amount exceeded the bank's actual exposure in Caldwell Ranch loans, meaning further bidding would represent speculation rather than debt recovery. Thornfield sensed the banker's reluctance and pressed his advantage, raising the bid to $1,100 with confidence that suggested he was prepared to go higher if necessary. The moment stretched as auctioneer Patch called for additional bids. Sarah Beth held her breath, calculating quickly whether $1,100 would cover all outstanding debts and leave something for her survival. The arithmetic was close but encouraging. She might emerge from this disaster with enough money to relocate and start over, assuming the bidding stopped at current levels. Then the stranger spoke for the first time, his voice carrying clearly across the courthouse square despite its moderate volume. $1,500. The bid stunned the crowd into silence. It exceeded Thornfield's offer by $400, jumping past the careful incremental increases that had characterized earlier bidding. More significantly, it suggested the speaker possessed both serious money and specific reasons for wanting the Caldwell property. Thornfield turned to stare at the stranger, his face reflecting surprise and calculation. $1,500 was more than anyone had expected the property to bring, possibly more than its actual market value. Competing against such a bid would require financial resources and determination that few men in the region possessed. The banker shook his head slightly, indicating the bank's withdrawal from further bidding. $1,600, Thornfield called, his voice tight with the strain of committing so much money to a single purchase. The stranger didn't hesitate. $2,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the bidding reached levels that seemed almost fantastical. $2,000 represented more cash than most residents saw in several years, enough money to purchase multiple ranches or establish a substantial business in town. The auctioneer called 3 times for additional bids, but no one responded. Thornfield had reached his limit. Banker Harwick showed no inclination to rejoin the bidding, and no other potential buyers emerged from the crowd. "Sold to the gentleman for $2,000, Patch announced, his voice carrying across the square with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Sarah Beth felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized what the sale meant. $2,000 would more than cover all outstanding debts, leaving her with several $100s to begin a new life somewhere else. The stranger had, through his aggressive bidding, transformed her complete financial ruin into the possibility of survival. But his motivations remained mysterious, and she wondered what had driven him to pay so much for property he had never inspected. The crowd began to disperse as the auction concluded, but many lingered to discuss the morning's surprising conclusion. The stranger's identity became the subject of immediate speculation, with various theories proposed about his background and intentions. Some suggested he represented Eastern investors seeking Western land opportunities. Others wondered if he might be connected to railroad development or mineral exploration. Dr. Henley approached Sarah Beth as the formal proceedings concluded. "How are you feeling?" she asked, professional concern evident in her voice. Sarah Beth managed a weak smile. "Better than I expected," she admitted. "I thought I would lose everything today." The physician nodded but continued studying her patient's condition. "The stress isn't good for you or the baby. You need rest and proper food." Judge Blackwood completed the legal paperwork required to transfer ownership, accepting the stranger's payment in cash that he produced from a leather satchel. The transaction's size and the buyer's preparedness to complete it immediately added to the mystery surrounding his identity and purposes. Sarah Beth watched from her chair as papers were signed and money changed hands, feeling detached from events that would determine her future. As the crowd continued to thin, the stranger approached Sarah Beth for the first time. He removed his hat politely, revealing dark hair streaked with grey and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face showed the weathering of outdoor work, but also an intelligence that suggested education and experience beyond typical ranch labor. He appeared to be in his 40s, old enough to have accumulated substantial wealth, but young enough to undertake new ventures. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place immediately. "I'm James Nathaniel Blackstone. I wanted to speak with you before leaving town." Sarah Beth struggled to stand from her chair, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. Blackstone gestured for her to remain seated. "Please don't trouble yourself. I know this has been a difficult day." "Thank you," Sarah Beth managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your bidding. It saved me from complete destitution." Blackstone nodded gravely. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Caldwell. Your husband had a reputation as an honest man and skilled rancher. I heard about him as far south as Colorado Springs." The comment surprised her. She hadn't known Thomas's reputation extended beyond their immediate region. "I have a proposition for you," Blackstone continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "The ranch house is well built and properly situated. Rather than forcing you to leave immediately, I'd like to offer you continued residence there until after your child is born and you've recovered sufficiently to travel. In exchange, you could manage the household and oversee any improvements I might want to make to the property." The offer stunned Sarah Beth completely. She had expected to be homeless within days, forced to seek charity housing in town, or perhaps refuge with her father at the saloon. The possibility of remaining in her own home, even temporarily, seemed too generous to believe. I don't understand," she stammered. "Why would you do that?" Blackstone replaced his hat and stepped back slightly. "I'm not a man who puts pregnant women out of their homes in winter, Mrs. Caldwell. Beyond that, the arrangement would benefit both of us. You know the property better than anyone, and I have business interests that will keep me traveling frequently. Having someone trustworthy managing things in my absence makes practical sense." Before Sarah Beth could respond, Dr. Henley intervened. "Mrs. Caldwell needs to rest and consider any such arrangements carefully," she said firmly. "This has been an exhausting day, and she's in no condition to make important decisions right now." Blackstone nodded respectfully. "Of course. I'll be staying at the boarding house for a few days while I handle business matters. Mrs. Caldwell can send word when she's ready to discuss details." As Blackstone walked away, Sarah Beth watched him with growing confusion and cautious hope. Nothing about the day had unfolded as she had expected. Instead of losing everything, she had emerged with enough money to survive and an unexpected offer that might allow her to remain in the home she loved. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to James Blackstone than he had revealed, and that accepting his generosity might come with complications she couldn't yet foresee. The boarding house dining room had never hosted a guest quite like James Nathaniel Blackstone. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh served breakfast with unusual attention to detail, her curiosity about the mysterious cattle baron barely contained behind professional courtesy. The other boarders, 3 ranch hands and a traveling salesman, ate their eggs and bacon while stealing glances at the man who had spent more money in a single morning than most of them earned in 2 years. Blackstone ate methodically, his attention focused on a leather-bound journal where he made notations between bites. His handwriting was precise, the mark of a man educated beyond the typical frontier standard. Occasionally, he would pause to study a hand-drawn map, marking locations with small symbols that meant nothing to casual observers but clearly held significance for him. "Quite a show you put on yesterday," commented Jake Morrison, one of the ranch hands, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. "Don't recall seeing you around these parts before." Blackstone looked up from his journal, his grey eyes measuring the speaker before responding. "I'm in the cattle business. Good land is worth paying for when you find it." The simple answer revealed nothing while appearing to explain everything. Morrison nodded, as if satisfied, but the other boarders exchanged glances that suggested they found the explanation inadequate. $2,000 represented more than the cost of good grazing land, especially property burdened with the complications of a recent tragedy and a pregnant widow who needed accommodation. After breakfast, Blackstone walked to the general store where Martha Peterson was arranging fabric bolts on the counter. Her husband, Robert, was checking inventory lists, preparing orders for winter supplies that would need to arrive before the railroad line became unreliable due to snow. Both Petersons looked up expectantly when Blackstone entered, their merchant, instincts recognizing a customer with substantial purchasing power. "I need to outfit a ranch house for extended occupation," Blackstone said without preamble. "Quality goods, not temporary solutions. The lady currently residing there will need proper furnishings and supplies to maintain herself comfortably through the winter." Martha Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly at the phrasing, which suggested continuing residence rather than immediate displacement. The shopping list Blackstone provided was comprehensive and expensive. He wanted furniture delivered to replace what had been sold at auction: a dining table and chairs, bedroom furnishings, kitchen equipment and household necessities. Additionally, he requested winter supplies in quantities that would sustain a household through months of isolation. Flour, sugar, coffee, preserved goods, lamp oil, and other staples that careful housekeepers accumulated before snowfall made. "Resupply impossible. This will cost considerable money," Robert Peterson warned, calculating rapidly as he reviewed the list. "And some items will need ordering from Denver, which means railroad shipping costs and possible delays." Blackstone produced a roll of bills from his coat pocket. "Order everything immediately and arrange delivery as soon as possible. Money isn't a concern." Word of Blackstone's purchases spread through Millbrook with the speed that characterized all news in small communities. By afternoon, speculation about his intentions had grown elaborate and varied. Some residents theorized he was establishing the ranch as headquarters for a large-scale cattle operation that would bring employment and prosperity to the region. Others wondered if his interest in Sarah Beth's comfort indicated romantic intentions, disguised as business arrangements. Dr. Henley visited the Caldwell Ranch that afternoon, ostensibly to check on Sarah Beth's medical condition, but actually to assess the situation developing between her patient and the mysterious benefactor. She found Sarah Beth in the nearly empty house, sitting in the single remaining chair while staring out the window at pastures that no longer belonged to her. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Henley asked, settling her medical bag on the bare floor. Sarah Beth turned from the window, her face reflecting exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "Strange," she admitted. "Yesterday I thought I would lose everything. Today I'm being offered more generosity than I know how to accept." The physician began her examination, checking Sarah Beth's pulse and listening to the baby's heartbeat with a stethoscope. "The child should arrive within 2 weeks," she observed, "possibly sooner if yesterday's stress triggers early labor. You need rest, proper nutrition, and freedom from worry, none of which you've had lately." "Mr. Blackstone's offer would provide all those things," Sarah Beth said hesitantly, "but I don't understand why he's making it. Men don't typically show such consideration for strangers, especially women in my circumstances." Dr. Henley completed her examination before responding, choosing her words carefully. "There are men who take advantage of vulnerable women, and there are men who protect them," she said finally. "In my professional experience, Mr. Blackstone's behavior suggests the latter category. But you're wise to be cautious. Accepting help always creates obligations, even when the giver claims otherwise." That evening, Blackstone arrived at the ranch driving a wagon loaded with supplies from the general store. He knocked politely on the front door and waited for Sarah Beth's permission. Before entering the house, his first action was to build up the fire in the stove, noting that the interior temperature was uncomfortably cold for a pregnant woman. "I took the liberty of ordering furnishings and supplies," he said, beginning to unload boxes from the wagon. "Nothing presumptuous, just necessities for comfortable living. If you decide not to accept my arrangement, these items will remain with the property regardless." The careful phrasing emphasized that his gifts came without strings attached, reducing the sense of obligation that might make acceptance difficult. Sarah Beth watched as he carried in flour, coffee, preserves, and other supplies that represented more abundance than she had seen in months. The coffee alone would have cost her several dollars, money she hadn't possessed since Thomas's death. "This is too much," she protested weakly. "I can't repay such generosity." "I'm not asking for repayment," Blackstone replied, arranging supplies in the kitchen with the efficiency of a man accustomed to managing practical details. "I'm asking for household management in exchange for temporary residence. The arrangement benefits both parties without creating debt or obligation beyond what we explicitly agree upon." He produced a written contract from his coat pocket, spreading it on the kitchen counter for her review. The document was professionally prepared, specifying terms with legal precision that protected both parties' interests. Sarah Beth would manage the household and oversee any improvements or maintenance Blackstone requested. In exchange, she could occupy the house until 6 months after her child's birth, with all living expenses provided by Blackstone. "You had this prepared in advance," Sarah Beth observed, studying the contract's detailed provisions. Blackstone nodded. "I make contingency plans for situations that interest me. Your husband's reputation and this property's potential convinced me to investigate possibilities before attending the auction. The contract included provisions Sarah Beth hadn't expected. If she chose to leave before the agreed term, she would receive $500 to assist with relocation. If Blackstone decided to terminate the arrangement early, she would receive $1,000 compensation. The terms were so favorable that accepting seemed almost mandatory for her child's welfare. "Why?" she asked, looking up from the contract. "You could hire a housekeeper for much less money. You could have bought better land elsewhere for what you paid yesterday. None of this makes business sense." Blackstone was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire he had built up in the stove. "I had a wife once," he said finally. "She died in childbirth when we were far from medical help. in a place where I had too little money to provide proper care. I couldn't save her, but I can prevent another woman from facing similar circumstances if opportunity presents itself. The explanation offered personal motivation that made his generosity comprehensible without seeming calculated to manipulate her emotions. Sarah Beth felt tears spring to her eyes as she imagined the tragedy that had shaped his character. "I'm sorry for your loss," she whispered, "and grateful for your kindness to someone who reminds you of painful memories." "You don't remind me of her," Blackstone said firmly. "You're a different person facing different circumstances, but having resources to help and failing to use them would dishonor her memory. She would have wanted me to protect other women when possible." Dr. Henley arrived as they were discussing contract details, having promised to check on Sarah Beth again before returning to town. She reviewed the document with the thoroughness of someone accustomed to protecting patients' interests, asking pointed questions about provisions that might prove problematic. Her examination satisfied her that Blackstone had constructed a genuinely fair arrangement. "The terms are generous to the point of being unusual," she told Sarah Beth privately while Blackstone waited outside. "But they're also legally binding and protective of your interests. Given your current circumstances and approaching delivery, I would recommend acceptance." The next morning brought the first significant snowfall of the season, heavy flakes that accumulated rapidly and transformed the landscape into a white expanse that stretched to the horizon. Sarah Beth woke to find fresh wood stacked beside the stove and coffee brewing in the kitchen. Blackstone had arrived before dawn to ensure her comfort, then departed without waiting for thanks or acknowledgement. Furniture deliveries began that afternoon despite the snow, with items arriving by sled from town. The dining table and chairs were solid oak construction that would last for decades. The bedroom furnishings included a mattress that was softer than anything Sarah Beth had slept on since childhood. Kitchen equipment was comprehensive and well-made, designed for serious cooking rather than temporary accommodation. By evening, the house had been transformed from an empty shell into a comfortable home. Sarah Beth moved through rooms that felt familiar yet different, recognizing the spaces while adjusting to new arrangements. The cradle Thomas had carved remained in its place beside the fireplace, Blackstone having specifically excluded it from any changes he authorized. The following days established routines that felt surprisingly natural. Blackstone would arrive each morning to tend fires and handle heavy work, then spend his days riding the property boundaries and making notes in his ever-present journal. He ate lunch with Sarah Beth when she prepared it, their conversations focusing on practical matters, rather than personal topics. Evenings found him reading by the fire while she worked on baby clothes, both content with companionable silence. His knowledge of ranching impressed her with its depth and scope. He could assess cattle health with expert eyes, identify grazing problems that needed attention, and discuss breeding strategies with sophistication that suggested years of successful experience. Yet he never boasted about his accomplishments or revealed details about operations he managed elsewhere. "You really are a cattle baron," Sarah Beth observed one afternoon as he explained his plans for improving the ranch's water system. Blackstone smiled slightly. "I own land and cattle in several states, but baron suggests inherited wealth and aristocratic pretensions. Everything I have was earned through work and careful decisions." Local residents gradually accepted Blackstone's presence in their community, though speculation about his background continued. Emil Kruger reported that the stranger paid for services with gold coins that bore dates from California mints. Dr. Henley mentioned his familiarity with medical procedures that suggested experience treating injuries in remote locations. Sheriff Cray observed his competence with firearms during a shooting demonstration that settled a dispute about marksmanship. The evidence suggested a man with diverse experience and substantial resources, but details remained elusive. Blackstone answered direct questions honestly while volunteering little additional information. His past remained largely mysterious, though his present actions consistently demonstrated competence and consideration. Sarah Beth found herself looking forward to their daily interactions, conversations that ranged from practical ranch management to books they had both read. Blackstone possessed education that included literature, history, and current events, making him an engaging discussion partner during long winter evenings. Yet he never presumed intimacy or suggested their arrangement might evolve beyond its stated terms. The baby moved more frequently now, responding to her mother's improved nutrition and reduced stress. Dr. Henley's weekly visits confirmed healthy development and normal progression toward delivery. The physician noted Sarah Beth's improved color and demeanor, crediting stable living conditions and adequate food for the positive changes. "He's an unusual man," Dr. Henley commented after observing one of Blackstone's visits. "Most wealthy men seeking to help attractive widows have ulterior motives that become apparent quickly. His behavior suggests genuine concern for your welfare without romantic complications." 2 weeks after the contract signing, Sarah Beth woke to contractions that announced her labor's beginning. Blackstone had left for town early that morning to conduct business, but Dr. Henley had anticipated the timing and arranged to stay overnight at the ranch. The physician's presence provided both medical expertise and emotional support during the long hours that followed. James Nathaniel Blackstone, Jr. was born just after midnight on a clear December evening when stars blazed with winter intensity. Across the prairie sky, he arrived healthy and vocal, announcing his presence with lusty cries that echoed through the ranch house. Sarah Beth held her son with tears of joy streaming down her face, overwhelmed by love for the small life she had protected through months of uncertainty. Blackstone returned the next morning to find mother and child doing well under Dr. Henley's care. He approached the bedside with quiet respect, offering congratulations and asking if any additional supplies were needed. His first sight of the baby evoked an expression of profound sadness that quickly passed, replaced by gentle pleasure. At the successful birth, "He's beautiful," Blackstone said softly, watching the infant sleep in his mother's arms. "Thomas would have been proud." The comment carried emotional weight that acknowledged both the baby's deceased father and the complicated circumstances of his birth. Sarah Beth nodded, unable to speak past the tears that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Over the following days, Blackstone proved unexpectedly helpful with infant care, displaying knowledge that suggested previous experience. With babies, he could prepare bottles with proper measurements, change diapers efficiently, and calm crying fits with techniques that impressed Dr. Henley. When questioned about his expertise, he mentioned caring for nieces and nephews during visits to family members. The winter deepened around the ranch, but inside the house warmth and contentment reigned. Sarah Beth recovered quickly from childbirth, aided by excellent nutrition and freedom from financial worries. Little James thrived under attentive care, growing stronger each day while developing the alert expression that suggested intelligence inherited from both parents. Blackstone continued his pattern of daily visits and evening conversations, but now his attention included the baby with obvious pleasure. He would hold the infant while Sarah Beth prepared meals, entertaining him with songs that revealed an unexpectedly good singing voice. The sight of the powerful man cradling the tiny child with infinite gentleness moved Sarah Beth in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You're good with children," she observed one evening as he rocked the baby to sleep. Blackstone's expression grew distant. "I always hoped to have children of my own someday. Life took different directions than I planned." The admission revealed vulnerability beneath his competent exterior, making him seem more human and accessible. As winter progressed towards spring, the arrangement that had begun as temporary convenience evolved into something approaching family. Sarah Beth found herself depending on Blackstone's presence, not just for practical support, but for companionship that enriched her daily life. His departure for business trips left the house feeling empty despite the baby's constant presence, but questions remained about the future. The contract specified terms lasting 6 months after the birth, meaning their arrangement would end in summer. Blackstone never mentioned plans beyond that deadline, and Sarah Beth hesitated to raise topics that might complicate their current harmony. Yet both understood that decisions about permanent arrangements couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The first hint of complications came in late February when a letter arrived for Blackstone, delivered by the weekly mail carrier, who struggled through snow drifts to reach the ranch. Sarah Beth noticed the envelope's expensive stationery and formal handwriting, suggesting correspondence from someone of importance. Blackstone read it privately, his expression growing increasingly grim as he absorbed its contents. "Business troubles?" Sarah Beth asked when he remained silent through dinner. Blackstone folded the letter carefully before responding. "Family obligations. My brother manages my Colorado interests, and there are decisions requiring my personal attention." The explanation was truthful but incomplete, leaving Sarah Beth with the uncomfortable sense that larger forces were influencing their peaceful existence. 2 days later, a second letter arrived, followed by a telegram that brought Blackstone to town for an urgent conference with banker Harwick. He returned that evening looking troubled, his usual calm demeanor replaced by visible tension. During their evening meal, he seemed distracted, answering Sarah Beth's conversational attempts with distracted responses that suggested his mind was elsewhere. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she finally asked directly. Blackstone looked up from his untouched plate, focusing on her with obvious effort. "You're already helping more than you know. But some situations require personal presence to resolve properly." He paused, studying her face as if memorizing its features. "I may need to travel to Colorado soon. Business that can't be handled through correspondence." The prospect of his departure alarmed Sarah Beth more than she had expected. Over the winter months, she had grown accustomed to his reliable presence, the security his protection provided, and the intellectual companionship that had become essential to her daily happiness. His absence would leave her alone with the baby in an isolated ranch house, dependent on neighbors for emergency assistance. "How long would you be gone?" she asked, trying to keep anxiety from her voice. Blackstone's hesitation before answering suggested the trip might be more complex than routine business. "Several weeks, possibly longer. It depends on what I find when I arrive there." He reached across the table to touch her hand briefly. "You would be safe here. Sheriff Cray has agreed to check the property regularly, and Dr. Henley will continue her visits." The physical contact surprised them both, the first time either had initiated such intimacy since their arrangement began. Blackstone withdrew his, and quickly, but the warmth of his touch lingered on Sarah Beth's skin like a memory she wanted to preserve. She found herself studying his face with new attention, noting details she had tried to ignore during their months of careful friendship. 3 days before his planned departure, Blackstone made an unexpected announcement during breakfast. "I've arranged for Mrs. Walsh to stay here while I'm away," he said, referring to the boarding house proprietor. "She's agreed to help with household management and provide companionship. Her presence should address any concerns about propriety or safety." Sarah Beth felt simultaneously grateful for the consideration and disappointed by its necessity. Mrs. Walsh was a competent, trustworthy woman whose presence would indeed provide practical benefits, but it would also eliminate the privacy and intimacy that had allowed Sarah Beth and Blackstone's relationship to develop naturally. The arrangement suggested he viewed their connection as requiring external supervision rather than internal regulation. "That's very thoughtful," Sarah Beth managed, though her tone lacked enthusiasm. Blackstone studied her expression carefully, apparently recognizing her mixed feelings about the plan. "Mrs. Walsh is discreet and understanding. Her presence shouldn't interfere with your normal routines or the baby's care." The night before his departure, Blackstone spent longer than usual beside the fire after Sarah Beth had retired to feed the baby. She could hear him moving about the main room, apparently restless despite the late hour. When little James finally fell asleep, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and returned to the kitchen for warm milk to help her own sleep. She found Blackstone standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit landscape with his hands clasped behind his back. The firelight cast shadows across his profile, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw and the premature grey that streaked his dark hair. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his expression revealing emotions he usually kept carefully controlled. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for making this winter more pleasant than I had any right to expect." Sarah Beth moved closer to the fire, pulling her shawl tighter against the night's chill. "I should be thanking you. You saved my life and my son's future when you had no obligation to either of us." "It wasn't obligation," Blackstone replied, his voice carrying intensity that made her look up sharply. "It was—" He stopped, apparently struggling to find appropriate words for feelings that had grown beyond their original boundaries. "It was privilege. Watching you rebuild your strength, seeing James grow healthy and happy, sharing meals and conversations with people who matter." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sarah Beth felt her heart beating faster as she recognized the depth of emotion behind his carefully chosen words. She had suspected her own feelings were evolving beyond gratitude and friendship, but hadn't dared hope his sentiments might be developing similarly. "You matter to us too," she said softly, the words carrying more meaning than their simple phrasing suggested. "James lights up when he sees you, and I've come to depend on your presence in ways that probably weren't wise." She paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. "I'll miss you more than I should while you're away." Blackstone moved closer, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his grey eyes. "Sarah Beth," he began, then stopped, apparently reconsidering whatever he had planned to say. Instead, he reached out to touch her cheek gently, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "We'll talk when I return. About everything." The promise carried weight that suggested their relationship's future would be decided during his absence, that the choices made in Colorado would determine whether their temporary arrangement could become something permanent. Sarah Beth leaned into his touch briefly before stepping back, understanding that some conversations required proper timing and circumstances. "Travel safely," she whispered. "Come back to us." The words emerged more intimate than she had intended, revealing the depth of her attachment despite her efforts to maintain appropriate distance. Blackstone nodded, his expression conveying both promise and uncertainty about what he might find waiting in Colorado. The silence that settled over the ranch after Blackstone's departure felt heavier than any snowfall. Sarah Beth stood at the kitchen window, watching his wagon disappear into the morning mist, while baby James slept peacefully in her arms. The house that had felt warm and alive with his presence now seemed too large, too quiet, filled with shadows that hadn't been noticeable when his confident voice filled the rooms. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh arrived that afternoon with 2 carpet bags and a determined expression that suggested she intended to manage the household with military precision. A woman in her 50s with steel grey hair and sharp blue eyes, She had operated Millbrook's boarding house for 12 years, earning respect for her practical competence and discretion regarding her guests' private affairs. "Mr. Blackstone has provided detailed instructions for maintaining this household," she announced, producing a typed list from her reticule. "He's thought of everything from baby care schedules to emergency procedures. The man certainly plans thoroughly." She examined the ranch house with professional assessment, noting improvements that had been made since the auction. Sarah Beth felt simultaneously grateful for the companionship and resentful of the supervision. Mrs. Walsh's presence represented security and propriety, but it also emphasized that she remained dependent on others' generosity rather than managing independently. The contrast with her previous months of partnership with Blackstone was stark and uncomfortable. The first week passed slowly, establishing routines that accommodated both women's preferences and the baby's needs. Mrs. Walsh proved surprisingly helpful with infant care, revealing experience gained from raising her own children years earlier. She could soothe James when he grew fussy, prepare bottles with expert precision, and diagnose minor ailments that might have worried a less experienced mother. "You're fortunate to have such a healthy child," Mrs. Walsh observed as she helped bathe the baby. "Some infants born under stressful circumstances struggle with development, but James shows every sign of thriving." She studied Sarah Beth carefully. Mr. Blackstone's support certainly contributed to the positive outcome. Letters arrived regularly from Colorado, though Blackstone's correspondence was carefully formal, addressing practical matters rather than personal concerns. He inquired about the baby's health, the household's needs, and any problems requiring attention. His tone remained warmly concerned, but professionally distant, as if he were aware that Mrs. Walsh might read communications addressed to Sarah Beth. Reading between the lines, Sarah Beth detected hints of complications in his Colorado business. References to unexpected developments and challenging negotiations suggested that his trip was extending beyond originally planned durations. One letter mentioned that his brother had made financial commitments requiring careful management, implying family obligations that might conflict with his personal preferences. Dr. Henley continued her weekly visits, checking both Sarah Beth's recovery and the baby's development. During these appointments, she often stayed for tea and conversation, providing Sarah Beth with intellectual companionship that partially compensated for missing Blackstone's daily discussions. The physician's observations about rural life, medical practice, and social changes offered perspectives that challenged Sarah Beth's thinking. "You seem restless," Dr. Henley commented during one visit, watching Sarah Beth pace while feeding the baby. Recovery from childbirth includes emotional adjustments as well as physical healing. The isolation and uncertainty about the future can create anxiety that affects your overall well-being. Sarah Beth appreciated the physician's directness. "I've grown accustomed to partnership in managing daily decisions," she admitted. "Making choices alone feels strange after months of collaboration." She paused, considering how much to reveal about her feelings. "I miss having someone to discuss ideas with, someone whose judgment I trust." Mrs. Walsh proved an unexpected source of wisdom about relationships and social dynamics. Having observed numerous courtships and marriages during her years managing the boarding house, she possessed insights about human nature that helped Sarah Beth understand her own emotional confusion. Their evening conversations often touched on topics that Blackstone's presence had made impossible to explore. "Men like Mr. Blackstone don't make commitments lightly," Mrs. Walsh observed one evening, as they worked on mending clothes. "But when they do commit, it's typically for life." His behavior suggests a man seriously considering permanent arrangements, though he's cautious about moving too quickly. The comment encouraged Sarah Beth while raising new anxieties about expectations. and timing. She had begun to hope that their relationship might evolve beyond their current arrangement, but Mrs. Walsh's insights suggested that Blackstone's careful approach might indicate deeper intentions than she had dared imagine. The possibility of genuine partnership seemed simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. March brought the first signs of spring's approach, with longer days and occasional warm afternoons that melted snow patches and revealed brown grass beneath. The seasonal change stirred restlessness in Sarah Beth that was difficult to define or address. She found herself walking the ranch's perimeter more frequently, carrying James in a sling while exploring areas she hadn't visited during winter's confinement. The property showed evidence of Blackstone's careful stewardship during his brief ownership. Fences had been repaired where needed, water systems improved to ensure reliable flow, and grazing areas managed to prevent overuse. His notes, left in a desk drawer, revealed planning that extended years into the future, suggesting he viewed the ranch as a permanent investment rather than temporary speculation. Local residents began visiting more frequently as travel conditions improved, ostensibly to check on Sarah Beth's welfare, but actually to gather information about Blackstone's absence and future plans. Their questions, though politely phrased, revealed curiosity about whether the mysterious cattle baron intended to remain in Millbrook permanently or would eventually sell the property and move on. Sheriff Cray stopped by weekly, fulfilling his promise to Blackstone while conducting his own informal investigation into the man's background and character. His conversations with Sarah Beth and Mrs. Walsh were casual but thorough, designed to assess whether Blackstone had behaved appropriately during his residence at the ranch. The sheriff's conclusion, shared with banker Harwick, was entirely positive. Regarding the arrangement's propriety, "He's a gentleman in the truest sense," Sheriff Cray reported to those who inquired. "Treats Mrs. Caldwell with complete respect, provides generously for her needs, and makes no demands that compromise her reputation. Whatever his reasons for helping her, they appear honorable." Emil Kruger's barbershop became the informal headquarters for speculation about Blackstone's Colorado business and its potential impact on his Millbrook investments. The theories ranged from routine cattle transactions to involvement in mining ventures or railroad development. Kruger, who prided himself on extracting information from customers, had collected hints and rumors that painted a picture of a man with diverse interests and substantial wealth. "He mentioned silver mines once," reported Marcus Thornfield during a haircut discussion, "and I heard him tell someone about shipping cattle to California markets. Could be he's involved in operations spanning half the Western territories." The barbershop audience absorbed this information with the satisfaction of men who enjoyed puzzling out mysteries. Dr. Henley received her own letter from Blackstone, requesting detailed reports on Sarah Beth's health and the baby's development. His questions demonstrated knowledge of postpartum complications and infant care that impressed the physician with its sophistication. She responded with comprehensive medical assessments that apparently satisfied his concerns about their welfare during his absence. "Mr. Blackstone writes like a man who has experience with medical situations," Dr. Henley mentioned to Sarah Beth. "His questions suggest familiarity with health problems that might arise after childbirth. Either he's very well read on medical topics or he's dealt with similar circumstances before." The observation reminded Sarah Beth of Blackstone's revelation about losing his wife in childbirth, adding poignancy to his concern for her recovery. She imagined him reading Dr. Henley's reports with anxiety born from previous tragedy, determined to prevent any repetition of loss under his responsibility. The thought deepened her appreciation for his careful attention to her welfare. April's arrival brought dramatic weather changes that transformed the ranch from winter desolation to spring promise. Snow melted rapidly, filling creeks and revealing green grass that had been dormant beneath frozen ground. The transformation energized Sarah Beth with hopes for renewal and growth that extended beyond seasonal changes to personal possibilities. James developed rapidly during this period, beginning to smile responsively and show interest in his surroundings that delighted both women caring for him. Mrs. Walsh proclaimed him exceptionally alert for his age, comparing his development favorably to other infants she had observed. His robust health validated the good care he had received from birth and suggested a promising future. Letters from Blackstone became less frequent, but more personal in tone, suggesting that whatever business had detained him was approaching resolution. He wrote about missing the ranch's peaceful atmosphere and looking forward to returning to routines that had become precious to him. Between formal phrases, Sarah Beth detected longing that matched her own feelings about his absence. Business. Matters are progressing satisfactorily, one letter reported, but I find myself eager to conclude negotiations and return to Millbrook. The ranch feels more like home than any place I've lived in recent years, and the people there have become important to my happiness in ways I didn't anticipate. The admission thrilled Sarah Beth, while raising questions about specific intentions behind his attachment to the ranch and its residents. She spent hours analyzing his phrasing for hints about romantic feelings versus general contentment with rural life. Mrs. Walsh observed these analytical sessions with amusement, but refrained from offering interpretations that might prove incorrect. Community. Social events resumed with spring's arrival, providing opportunities for Sarah Beth to interact with neighbors she hadn't seen regularly during winter isolation. The church social in late April marked her first public appearance since the baby's birth, generating considerable interest in both her recovery and James's development. She attended with Mrs. Walsh as chaperone, careful to maintain appropriate dignity. "You look remarkably well," Martha Peterson observed, studying Sarah Beth's appearance with the frank assessment common among frontier women. "Rural life agrees with you, and motherhood suits you perfectly. The baby is beautiful. He has your eyes, but a strong jaw that probably comes from his father's side." The conversation included inevitable questions about Blackstone's return and future plans for the ranch. Sarah Beth answered diplomatically, acknowledging his generosity while avoiding speculation about permanent arrangements. Her responses satisfied curiosity without revealing private hopes or concerns that might become subject to community gossip. Reverend Pierce approached during the social, expressing satisfaction with her situation and the baby's healthy development. "Mr. Blackstone's kindness reflects Christian charity at its finest," he observed. "Supporting a widow and child without expectation of reward demonstrates true nobility of character. Our community is fortunate to have attracted someone with such generous impulses." The pastor's approval carried weight in Millbrook's social hierarchy, helping to cement positive opinions about Blackstone's behavior and Sarah Beth's reputation. Any whispers about impropriety had been silenced by visible evidence of respectful treatment and Mrs. Walsh's presence as chaperone. The arrangement now enjoyed full community acceptance as appropriate and beneficial. May brought news that Blackstone's return was imminent, expected within the week, according to his latest correspondence. The announcement generated excitement in Sarah Beth that she tried to control but couldn't entirely suppress. Mrs. Walsh noticed her increased attention to household details and personal appearance, preparations that suggested anticipation of judgment by someone whose opinion mattered deeply. "You care for him considerably," Mrs. Walsh observed, without criticism during their final evening together. "It's natural, given his kindness and the circumstances that brought you together. But remember that gratitude can complicate romantic feelings, making it difficult to distinguish between appreciation and affection." The warning was kindly meant and carefully considered, reflecting Mrs. Walsh's experience with relationships complicated by obligation and dependency. Sarah Beth appreciated the concern, while recognizing that her feelings had evolved beyond simple gratitude months earlier. She cared for Blackstone as a person, not just as a benefactor, though untangling those emotions remained challenging. The night before his expected return, Sarah Beth found herself unable to sleep despite exhaustion from a busy day preparing the house for his arrival. She walked the rooms quietly, remembering conversations they had shared, moments of connection that had surprised them both, the gradual development of partnership that had felt natural despite its unusual circumstances. James stirred in his cradle, requiring attention that distracted her temporarily from anxious anticipation. As she fed and comforted him, she reflected on how much their lives had changed since Blackstone's intervention at the auction. The baby who might have grown up in poverty would instead enjoy security and opportunity. She herself had been transformed. From a desperate widow into a confident woman with genuine choices about her future. The transformation hadn't occurred through dramatic gestures or passionate declarations, but through accumulation of small acts that demonstrated respect, consideration, and growing affection. Blackstone had rebuilt her sense of worth through daily proof that she mattered to someone who had no obligation to care. The foundation they had constructed together was solid precisely because it had been built gradually, with attention to both practical needs and emotional growth. Whatever decisions awaited them regarding permanent arrangements, Sarah Beth knew that the months they had shared had changed her permanently. She had rediscovered strength she thought had died with Thomas, learned to trust again despite betrayal by circumstances, and found hope for happiness that extended beyond mere survival. Blackstone's return would determine whether that hope could be fulfilled, but its existence no longer depended on his choices alone. The morning of his return dawned clear and warm, with the kind of golden light that made the spring landscape appear freshly painted. Sarah Beth rose early, feeding James before beginning preparations that she told herself were routine household management, but knew were actually efforts to create the perfect homecoming. She baked bread with flour from the supplies Blackstone had provided, prepared coffee from beans he had personally selected, and arranged wildflowers throughout the house in mason jars that caught the sunlight streaming through clean windows. Mrs. Walsh observed these preparations with knowing eyes, but made no comment beyond offering to hold the baby, while Sarah Beth changed into her best dress. The garment, a deep green cotton that had been Thomas's favorite, fit her recovered figure perfectly and brought out the color of her eyes in ways that years of worry had dimmed. She braided her hair carefully, leaving tendrils loose around her face, in a style that was both practical and flattering. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Walsh said simply, adjusting the baby's blanket as he dozed in her arms. "More importantly, you look happy. Contentment suits you better than any cosmetic could." The older woman paused, studying Sarah Beth's face with maternal concern. "Remember that whatever happens today, you've already proven you can survive and thrive. Don't forget your own worth in the excitement of his return." The sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road sent Sarah Beth's heart racing, though she forced herself to remain calm as she moved to the kitchen window. Blackstone's familiar figure appeared through the morning haze, driving the same wagon he had taken to Colorado, but looking somehow different, older perhaps, or simply marked by experiences she couldn't yet understand. He guided his horses toward the barn with the same careful competence she remembered, but his movements seemed weighted with fatigue that suggested difficult weeks behind him. She met him at the front door, baby James cradled in her arms as a living symbol of the life that had flourished during his absence. Blackstone dismounted slowly, removing his hat as he approached, with eyes that seemed to drink in every detail of the scene. The well-maintained house, the flower-filled yard, the picture of mother and child waiting to welcome him home. His face revealed emotions too complex for simple interpretation, but relief and joy were clearly prominent among them. "Welcome back," Sarah Beth said, her voice steadier than her pulse. "We've missed you." The simple words carried weight that both understood, acknowledging the depth of feeling that had developed during their separation. Blackstone stepped closer, his gaze moving from her face to the baby and back again, as if reassuring himself that both were real and well. "You look," he began, then stopped, apparently struggling to find words adequate for what he was seeing. "Radiant. Motherhood agrees with you completely." He gestured toward the house and yard. "Everything is perfect. More than perfect." His voice carried wonder that suggested he had feared returning to find changes that would diminish the happiness he remembered. James chose that moment to wake and focus on the tall figure before him, his infant gaze showing the kind of recognition that develops through daily interaction. Blackstone extended a finger, which the baby grasped with surprising strength, eliciting a smile that transformed the man's tired features into something approaching joy. "He's grown so much," Blackstone murmured, "and he remembers me." Mrs. Walsh appeared in the doorway, having given them a few moments for private reunion before asserting her chaperone responsibilities. "Mr. Blackstone," she said warmly, "you look like a man who needs a good meal and proper rest. Sarah Beth has been preparing for your return all week." Her tone suggested approval of both his presence and the obvious affection between them, while maintaining the propriety that protected Sarah Beth's reputation. Inside the house, Blackstone moved through rooms that had clearly been maintained with loving care during his absence. Every surface gleamed, fresh flowers brightened corners that had been bare when he left, and the overall atmosphere suggested a home rather than merely a residence. He paused frequently to examine details, touching furniture he had purchased as if confirming its reality and permanence. "The ranch prospered under your management," he told Sarah Beth as they shared the meal she had prepared. "The property reports I received from Sheriff Cray were entirely positive, and Dr. Henley's letters about your health eased concerns that had troubled me throughout the trip." He paused, meeting her eyes across the table, "But no reports could convey what I see now. The peace in your expression, the confidence in your bearing, the contentment that radiates from you both." The conversation that followed revealed fragments of his Colorado experiences without providing complete details about the business complications that had delayed his return. A mining venture had required restructuring after his brother's poor decisions threatened financial disaster. Family obligations had demanded personal attention to prevent losses that could have affected all his operations. Legal complications had consumed weeks in courtrooms and lawyers' offices, resolving disputes that could have destroyed years of careful building. "The situation is resolved satisfactorily," he concluded, "but it reminded me how quickly financial security can disappear without proper management. It also clarified what matters most to me, not the accumulation of wealth for its own sake, but the ability to protect and provide for people I care about." His eyes remained fixed on Sarah Beth as he spoke, making clear that she and James were prominently included in that category. Mrs. Walsh excused herself after the meal, claiming fatigue from her extended stay, but actually providing them with privacy for conversations that her presence would constrain. Her departure left Sarah Beth and Blackstone alone together for the first time since his emotional goodbye months earlier, creating opportunity for discussions that letters couldn't accommodate. "There are things we need to talk about," Blackstone said, settling into the chair by the fireplace that had become his customary evening position. Decisions about the future that have been postponed too long. Sarah Beth nodded, understanding that their temporary arrangement's scheduled end was approaching and permanent plans needed consideration. "The contract expires in 6 weeks," she said quietly, voicing what they both knew. "I've been grateful for every day it's provided, but I understand that circumstances change and obligations end." Her tone was carefully neutral, offering him freedom to choose without pressure while concealing her own hopes for continuation. Blackstone leaned forward, his expression intent. "Sarah Beth, I need you to understand something important. This arrangement was never intended as temporary charity. From the beginning, I hoped it might become something permanent, a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and affection." He paused, gathering courage for complete honesty. "I've come to love you and James as family. The question isn't whether I want you to stay, but whether you want a future that includes me." The declaration struck Sarah Beth with force that left her momentarily speechless. She had hoped for such words, but hadn't dared to expect them, uncertain whether her own feelings were reciprocated or merely tolerated out of kindness. Hearing him acknowledge love transformed everything about their situation and future possibilities. "I love you too," she whispered, the words emerging easily despite their enormous implications. "I've loved you for months, but was afraid to hope you might feel the same way." She looked down at James, sleeping peacefully in her lap. "We both love you. You've been more than a benefactor or protector. You've been the foundation that allowed us to heal and grow strong again." The admission opened floodgates of emotion that had been carefully controlled throughout their careful courtship. They talked late into the evening, sharing feelings, fears, hopes, and dreams that had been suppressed during his absence. The conversation revealed the depth of connection that had developed through months of shared daily life, confirming that their bond was substantial enough to support permanent commitment. The engagement announcement in the Millbrook Weekly Herald created ripples of excitement throughout the community, though few residents were genuinely surprised by the news. Sarah Beth Caldwell and James Nathaniel Blackstone would marry in June, with Reverend Pierce performing the ceremony at the ranch rather than in the church sanctuary. The decision to hold a private ceremony reflected both their desire for intimacy and the practical consideration of accommodating guests at the property that had brought them together. Dr. Henley expressed unqualified approval of the match when she made her weekly visit. "Mr. Blackstone has proven his character through months of honorable behavior," she told Sarah Beth as she examined baby James. "More importantly, you've both had time to know each other as real people rather than romantic ideals. That foundation will serve you well through whatever challenges marriage brings." The physician's blessing carried particular weight in Millbrook's social hierarchy, given her medical training and observational skills. Her public endorsement of the engagement helped silence any remaining whispers about the propriety of their courtship or the circumstances that had brought them together. Even the most critical community members found it difficult to question arrangements that had produced such obviously positive results. Wedding preparations proceeded smoothly through May, with local women contributing their expertise to ensure a celebration worthy of the occasion. Martha Peterson organized the catering, drawing on her network of skilled cooks to plan a menu that would accommodate guests ranging from prominent ranchers to working families. The Church Ladies' Auxiliary took responsibility for decorations, transforming the ranch house and yard into a setting that reflected both elegance and frontier practicality. Sarah Beth's wedding dress was crafted from silk fabric ordered specially from Denver, a gesture of generosity from Blackstone that prompted tears of gratitude when the material arrived. The design was simple but sophisticated, accommodating her figure while creating an appearance of timeless beauty. Mrs. Walsh supervised the sewing with expert precision, ensuring every detail met standards worthy of a bride marrying into prosperity. The guest list included most of Millbrook's residents plus business associates from Blackstone's various enterprises, creating an event that would be remembered as one of the community's most significant social occasions. Judge Blackwood agreed to extend his circuit schedule to attend, lending official dignity to the proceedings. Sheriff Cray would serve as one of Blackstone's groomsmen, an honor that reflected their growing friendship and mutual respect. But prosperity and happiness had a way of attracting unwelcome attention, particularly in frontier communities where desperate men saw opportunity in others' good fortune. The first sign of trouble appeared on a Tuesday morning in late May, when a stranger arrived at the general store asking detailed questions about the Caldwell Ranch and its current ownership. His inquiries seemed casual, but their specificity suggested knowledge that extended beyond simple curiosity. The man gave his name as William Garrett and claimed to be a land agent investigating property values for Eastern investors. He was well dressed, but carried himself with an alertness that suggested familiarity with danger. His questions focused on the ranch's livestock, financial arrangements, and the people currently residing there. Martha Peterson answered politely, but shared his visit with her husband, who mentioned it to Sheriff Cray. 2 days later, a second stranger appeared at Emil Kruger's barbershop, engaging the proprietor in conversation about local ranches and their operations. This man, calling himself Frank Morrison, showed particular interest in recent property transfers and newcomers to the region. His casual mention of valuable cattle and isolated locations made Kruger uncomfortable enough to report the conversation to authorities. Sheriff Cray began investigating the stranger's presence with the methodical approach that had served him well in 8 years of frontier law enforcement. Both men had registered at the boarding house under names that might be genuine or assumed, paying cash for accommodations while claiming to represent business interests that couldn't be easily verified. Their behavior was technically legal, but sufficiently suspicious to warrant careful monitoring. The third warning came from an unexpected source, Dr. Henley, who encountered one of the strangers during her medical rounds at a neighboring ranch. The man, suffering from what appeared to be a genuine stomach ailment, had requested treatment while asking seemingly innocent questions about local families and their circumstances. His specific interest in the Caldwell Ranch and Sarah Beth's situation raised alarms that prompted the physician to contact authorities immediately. He knew too much about personal details, Dr. Henley reported to Sheriff Cray. Information about the auction, the baby's birth date, even questions about Mr. Blackstone's business travels. That level of knowledge suggests deliberate investigation rather than casual interest. Her medical training had taught her to recognize patterns that others might miss, and the stranger's questions followed a suspicious progression. Sheriff Cray shared his concerns with Blackstone during a private meeting at the bank, outlining the evidence that suggested organized interest in the ranch and its residents. The 3 strangers had arrived separately but were staying at the same boarding house, conducting what appeared to be coordinated reconnaissance while maintaining the fiction of independent business activities. Could be rustlers planning to steal cattle, Sheriff Cray suggested, or men looking to rob someone they think has money. Either way, they're gathering information for purposes that probably aren't legal. He studied Blackstone's reaction carefully. You mentioned having enemies in Colorado. Any chance these men are connected to that situation? Blackstone's expression grew grim as he considered the possibility. His Colorado difficulties had involved more than simple business disputes. They had included threats from competitors who viewed his success as obstacles to their own ambitions. Resolving those conflicts had required legal action that made him additional enemies, men who might seek revenge through attacks on what he valued most. "There are people who would profit from my misfortune," Blackstone admitted carefully. "Business, rivals, who might use personal attacks to achieve advantages they couldn't gain through legitimate competition." He paused, calculating probabilities with the strategic thinking that had built his fortune. If these men represent such interests, they pose serious dangers to everyone at the ranch. The conversation resulted in immediate security improvements, though Blackstone was careful to implement them without alarming Sarah Beth unnecessarily. He hired additional ranch hands, ostensibly to help with preparations for expanding cattle operations, but actually to provide protection through increased numbers. Sheriff Cray agreed to patrol the area more frequently, while deputies were instructed to monitor the strangers' activities closely. But the most concerning development came when the strangers suddenly departed Millbrook without completing whatever business had brought them to the region. Their abrupt exit suggested either mission completion or plans that required implementation elsewhere. Sheriff Cray's investigation revealed they had traveled south toward Colorado, raising fears that additional threats might be organizing beyond local law enforcement's jurisdiction. Blackstone made the difficult decision to share these concerns with Sarah Beth, understanding that ignorance would increase rather than decrease her danger. He approached the conversation carefully, emphasizing precautions rather than dwelling on potential threats, while ensuring she understood the seriousness of the situation they faced. "There may be people who want to harm me through attacking what I care about most," he told her during a quiet evening conversation. "I've taken steps to improve our security, but you need to be aware that dangers exist beyond the normal risks of ranch life." His voice carried the controlled tension of a man accustomed to violence, but hoping to avoid it. Sarah Beth received the news with remarkable composure, her experiences with adversity having taught her to face challenges directly rather than waste energy on panic. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her tone reflecting determination rather than fear. "I won't let threats prevent us from building the life we want together." Her response reinforced Blackstone's conviction that he had chosen his partner wisely. Where other women might have demanded retreat to safer locations, Sarah Beth was prepared to stand and fight for what they had built together. Her courage matched his own, providing strength that would be essential for surviving whatever trials awaited them. The security measures expanded to include weapons training for Sarah Beth, who proved surprisingly adept with both rifle and pistol under Blackstone's patient instruction. Her natural coordination and steady nerves, combined with motivation to protect her child, made her quickly proficient enough to contribute meaningfully to the ranch's defense. Dr. Henley, observing one practice session, commented approvingly on her progress. "Frontier women need to be able to defend themselves and their families," the physician observed. "Too many tragedies occur because people assume they're safe from violence that can strike anywhere. You're wise to develop skills that might never be needed but could save lives if circumstances require their use." The wedding date remained unchanged despite the security concerns, though guest accommodations were modified to ensure better protection for attendees. Additional men were stationed around the property during the ceremony, while Sheriff Cray coordinated with neighboring law enforcement to monitor approaches to the ranch. The celebration would proceed as planned, but with vigilance that reflected the dangerous realities of their situation. 2 weeks before the scheduled ceremony, a letter arrived that confirmed Blackstone's worst fears about the strangers' identities and purposes. The correspondence, delivered through intermediaries who couldn't be traced easily, contained threats that were specific enough to be credible while remaining sufficiently vague to avoid providing evidence for legal prosecution. The letter demanded that Blackstone abandon his Millbrook interests and return to Colorado for discussions about his business practices and their impact on other parties' welfare. Failure to comply would result in unfortunate consequences for people he cared about, with particular emphasis on the vulnerability of isolated ranches and their residents. The threatening tone was unmistakable despite the formal language used. To convey it, "They want me away from here so they can act without facing direct retaliation," Blackstone explained to Sheriff Cray after sharing the letter's contents. "Separating me from Sarah, Beth, and James would eliminate the protection I can provide while making them easier targets for whatever revenge these people are planning." The law enforcement response was immediate and comprehensive. Sheriff Cray contacted federal marshals with jurisdiction over interstate threats, while also coordinating with Colorado authorities to investigate the letter's origins. Additional deputies were assigned to the Millbrook area, creating a security presence that would deter most criminal activities while demonstrating official commitment to protecting the ranch. But the most significant development was Blackstone's decision to accelerate their wedding timeline, moving the ceremony from its planned June date to the following weekend. His reasoning was both romantic and strategic. Marriage would strengthen their legal position while creating additional incentives for the community to support their defense against outside threats. "I want you as my wife before we face whatever comes next," he told Sarah Beth when proposing the schedule change. "Not because I fear we won't survive, but because I want our commitment formalized before anything can interfere with our happiness." His proposal carried urgency that reflected both love and determination to complete their union, despite external pressures. Sarah Beth agreed immediately, understanding that circumstances had created timing that required flexibility rather than elaborate planning. Their love had grown strong enough to transcend ceremonial details, while the threats they faced together had created bonds that formal vows would simply acknowledge rather than create. The wedding would happen on schedule, regardless of who might object to their happiness. The news of the accelerated timeline spread through Millbrook with characteristic speed, generating community support that demonstrated how thoroughly the couple had been accepted by their neighbors. Volunteers stepped forward to ensure that a week's preparation could accomplish what had originally been planned for a month, with everyone understanding that external pressures made rapid action necessary. But as the new wedding date approached, evidence mounted that their enemies were closer than anyone had realized. Strange riders were spotted on neighboring properties, apparently conducting surveillance while avoiding direct contact with residents. Livestock showed signs of disturbance that suggested someone was testing the ranch's security measures. Most ominously, threatening messages began appearing in locations where they were certain to be discovered. The final escalation came 3 days before the wedding, when shots were fired at the ranch house during the night hours. No one was injured, but the bullets struck close enough to windows to make their threatening intent unmistakable. Sheriff Cray's investigation found evidence of multiple shooters positioned at calculated distances, suggesting professional planning rather than random violence. "They're trying to terrorize you into submission," Sheriff Cray concluded after examining the bullet holes and surrounding evidence. "The shots were aimed to frighten rather than kill, but that could change if they decide intimidation isn't working." His expression was grim as he contemplated the escalating nature of the threats they faced. Blackstone's response was swift and decisive. He sent word to business associates throughout the region, calling in favors and requesting assistance that would transform the ranch into a fortress capable of withstanding serious assault. Men began arriving within hours, experienced fighters who owed Blackstone debts or shared his commitment to protecting innocent people from criminal violence. The transformation was remarkable in its speed and effectiveness. By the following morning, The ranch house was surrounded by defensive positions that commanded every approach route. Guards patrolled constantly, while lookouts maintained surveillance from elevated positions that provided early warning of any threats. The wedding would take place as scheduled, but within a security perimeter that reflected military-level planning. Sarah Beth watched these preparations with fascination rather than fear, her confidence in Blackstone's protective abilities reinforced by the competence of the men who responded to his call for help. She had married one man in peacetime and was preparing to marry another in what increasingly resembled a state of war, but her determination to proceed remained absolute. Whatever their planning, she told Dr. Henley during a final prenatal visit, they'll discover that we're stronger together than they expected. James and I have found our protector, and I trust his judgment completely about how to keep us safe. Her voice carried conviction that impressed the physician with its steadfast courage. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything they had built together, but also for a wedding that would demonstrate their refusal to let fear dictate their choices. Love had brought them together, and love would see them through whatever challenges their enemies could devise. The morning of the wedding dawned with an eerie stillness that made every sound seem amplified and threatening. Sarah Beth woke before sunrise to find Blackstone already gone, having spent the night with his security team making final preparations for both the ceremony and the expected attack. The house felt different with armed men positioned around its perimeter, safer in some ways, but charged with tension that made relaxation impossible. Dr. Henley arrived early to help with wedding preparations, her medical bag supplemented by supplies that suggested she was prepared for treating injuries as well as nervous brides. Her presence provided both practical assistance and emotional support, while her calm demeanor helped counteract the anxiety that permeated the household. Despite everyone's attempts to maintain festive spirits, "You look beautiful," Dr. Henley said, as she helped Sarah Beth into the silk wedding dress that had arrived from Denver just days earlier. The garment fit perfectly despite the rushed alterations, its elegant simplicity creating an appearance of timeless grace that transcended the dangerous circumstances surrounding the ceremony. More importantly, you look determined. That strength will serve you well today. The guest list had been dramatically reduced for security reasons, with only essential family and closest friends permitted to attend the ceremony. Martha Peterson arrived with her husband to oversee the reduced but carefully planned refreshments, while Emil Kruger came armed and ready to serve as an additional guard, despite his official role as wedding photographer. Even Reverend Pierce carried a concealed weapon beneath his ceremonial robes, understanding that frontier ministers sometimes needed to defend their flocks with more than prayers. Baby James seemed oblivious to the tension that affected every adult present, cooing happily in Mrs. Walsh's arms while she dressed him in the christening gown that had been hurriedly modified to serve as wedding attire. His innocent pleasure in the attention and activity provided moments of joy that reminded everyone why they were fighting to protect this family's happiness. Blackstone appeared at the appointed hour, wearing a new black suit that emphasized his imposing stature while concealing the weapons he carried beneath the formal clothing. His face showed the strain of commanding defensive preparations while trying to focus on the most important day of his personal life. But his eyes softened when he saw Sarah Beth descending the stairs in her wedding dress. "You're the most beautiful bride in Colorado territory," he said softly, taking her hands in his with gentle reverence that made the dangerous circumstances momentarily disappear. "I'm honored that you're willing to marry me under these conditions, when postponement would be the safer choice." His voice carried gratitude that went beyond words to acknowledge her courage in proceeding, despite obvious risks. The ceremony began promptly at noon, with Reverend Pierce conducting abbreviated vows that focused on essential commitments rather than elaborate liturgy. The exchange of rings was witnessed by a carefully positioned audience that included several men whose attention remained divided between the proceedings and potential threats from surrounding areas. Sheriff Cray stood at the back of the room, his hand resting casually on his sidearm while his eyes scanned approaches to the house. "Do you, James Nathaniel Blackstone, take Sarah Beth Caldwell to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, in good times and in bad, for as long as you both shall live?" Reverend Pierce's voice carried clearly through the room, his words taking on additional significance given the immediate dangers they faced. "I do," Blackstone replied firmly, his commitment encompassing not just matrimonial vows, but promises to protect and defend his new family against any threats. Sarah Beth's answering "I do" carried equal determination, sealing their union at the moment when their love faced its greatest test. The kiss that followed was brief but intense, witnessed by friends who understood they might be observing the last peaceful moment before violence erupted. The wedding breakfast proceeded with forced normalcy, guests making conversation while remaining alert for signs of approaching trouble. Martha Peterson's carefully prepared refreshments were consumed with appreciation that reflected both hunger and nervous energy, while toasts were offered with weapons within easy reach of every speaker. The surreal combination of celebration and preparation for battle created an atmosphere unlike any wedding in Millbrook's history. The first sign of approaching danger came from the lookouts positioned on the barn roof, who signaled the approach of riders from multiple directions. Sheriff Cray received the reports with grim satisfaction, having expected such coordination from enemies who had planned their attack carefully. "They're coming from 3 sides," he announced quietly to Blackstone, "probably trying to prevent escape while concentrating maximum force against our defenses." Blackstone immediately ordered the guests to move into the house's most protected areas, with women and children taking shelter in the basement, while men took defensive positions. At windows and doorways, the transformation from wedding reception to fortress preparation happened with practiced efficiency that reflected careful planning and competent leadership under pressure. Sarah Beth refused to retreat to the basement with the other women, insisting on remaining where she could contribute to the defense while staying close to Blackstone and baby James. Her marksmanship skills, developed during weeks of intensive training, made her a valuable addition to the defensive force rather than simply another person requiring protection. Dr. Henley supported her decision, understanding that separation from her family would increase rather than decrease her anxiety. "How many are there?" Sarah Beth asked, as she checked her rifle and positioned herself at a window that commanded a clear view of the eastern approach. Blackstone consulted reports from his various lookouts before answering. "At least 15, possibly more. Professional fighters, well-armed and organized. This isn't a random attack, it's a coordinated assault designed to eliminate us completely." The realization that their enemies intended lethal rather than intimidating violence added urgency to the defensive preparations while clarifying the stakes involved in the coming battle. These weren't rustlers seeking easy profit or criminals looking for quick scores. They were killers hired to eliminate specific targets regardless of collateral damage to innocent people caught in the crossfire. The attackers approached with military precision, using natural cover to advance while maintaining communication through signals that suggested professional training. Their coordination and equipment indicated substantial financial backing, confirming that powerful interests viewed Blackstone's activities as threats requiring permanent elimination. The systematic nature of their assault made clear that negotiation or compromise were not viable options. "They mean to finish this today," Sheriff Cray observed as he studied the approaching forces through field glasses. "No retreat, no prisoners, no witnesses. We're fighting for our lives." His assessment was delivered without panic, but with the stark clarity needed for effective resistance against overwhelming odds. Blackstone gathered his defenders for final instructions before the battle began, his voice carrying calm authority that inspired confidence despite their dangerous situation. "We have strong positions, good fields of fire, and motivation they can't match," he told the men who had rallied to protect his family. "They may have numbers, but we have everything to fight for. Make every shot count, watch your partner's backs, and remember that surrender isn't an option they're offering." The first shots came from the south, where attackers attempted to rush the barn while drawing defensive fire away from their main assault on the house. The diversionary tactic was transparent but effective, forcing Blackstone to divide his limited forces between multiple threats while preventing concentration of firepower against any single advance. The battle had begun with professional competence that promised a deadly and prolonged engagement. Sarah Beth fired her first shot at a man attempting to reach the house's front porch, her bullet striking him center mass and dropping him before he could achieve his objective. The successful defense of her new home felt grimly satisfying, though she felt no pleasure in taking a human life, even under these circumstances. The reality of lethal combat was different from target practice, but her determination to protect her family overcame any hesitation about using deadly force. As gunfire erupted around the ranch house, baby James began crying in response to the terrifying sounds that invaded his previously peaceful world. Sarah Beth handed her rifle to Dr. Henley temporarily while she comforted her son, understanding that his distress would only worsen as the battle intensified. The juxtaposition of wedding celebration and mortal combat created emotional dissonance that threatened to overwhelm anyone who contemplated it too deeply. "This ends today," Blackstone declared as he moved between defensive positions, coordinating resistance while looking for opportunities to take offensive action against their attackers. "One way or another, when the sun sets, our family will be safe from these threats forever." His words carried determination that mixed love with lethal intent, showing how far a good man would go to protect what mattered most to him. The battle for the Blackstone Ranch raged for nearly 3 hours, transforming the peaceful homestead into a battlefield where love and hatred met in violent collision. Smoke from burning outbuildings drifted across the yard, while the crack of rifle fire punctuated desperate shouts and the screams of wounded men. What had begun as a wedding celebration had become a fight for survival that would determine whether good intentions could triumph over calculated evil. Sarah Beth proved herself a formidable defender, her rifle speaking with deadly accuracy from her position at the front window. She had never imagined that her wedding day would require her to take human lives, but maternal instinct and protective love eliminated any hesitation about doing whatever was necessary to safeguard her family. Each shot was carefully aimed, each target chosen for maximum impact on the attacker's ability to threaten her home. Blackstone moved through the house like a force of nature, directing defensive fire while seeking opportunities to break the siege through offensive action. His military experience, gained during frontier conflicts that predated his ranching career, showed in tactical decisions that maximized their limited numbers while exploiting weaknesses in the attacker's coordination. Despite being outnumbered, his forces held their positions through superior marksmanship and desperate motivation. Dr. Henley transformed the kitchen into a field hospital, treating wounds sustained by defenders while maintaining her own contribution to the battle when medical duties permitted. Her medical training proved invaluable for keeping wounded men in the fight, while her steady nerves under fire inspired everyone around her. She had delivered babies and treated injuries throughout her career, but this was her first experience combining medical practice with active combat. The turning point came when Sheriff Cray's carefully planned reinforcements arrived from town, having traveled cross-country to avoid detection by enemy lookouts. The additional fighters, consisting of volunteers who had been armed and organized secretly, struck the attackers from behind while they were focused on the ranch house. The surprise assault disrupted their coordination and forced them to fight on two fronts simultaneously. Emil Kruger distinguished himself during the counterattack, his hunting skills and knowledge of local terrain allowing him to approach enemy positions undetected. His German military background, which had seemed irrelevant during peacetime barbering, proved decisive in flanking maneuvers that eliminated key attackers and created confusion in their ranks. The mild-mannered businessman revealed a warrior's heart when circumstances demanded violence. The battle's climax occurred when Blackston led a direct assault on the attackers' command position, having identified their leader through observation of their tactical communications. The frontal attack was suicidally brave, but strategically necessary, designed to decapitate their organization and break their ability to coordinate effective resistance. Sarah Beth provided covering fire from the house, her shots keeping enemy heads down while her husband advanced through deadly ground. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brief but savage, with Blackston's size and experience ultimately prevailing against desperate men who understood that capture meant hanging for their crimes. The death of their leader, a Colorado gunfighter named Vance Morrison, who had been hired specifically to eliminate Blackstone, ended organized resistance and sent surviving attackers fleeing toward whatever horses they could reach. Sheriff Cray's pursuit of the fleeing attackers continued throughout the afternoon, with mounted posses tracking scattered groups who had abandoned coordination in favor of individual survival. Several were captured alive, providing information about their employers and the broader conspiracy that had targeted the Blackstone family. The evidence gathered would eventually lead to arrests and prosecutions that extended far beyond Millbrook's jurisdiction. As evening approached, the ranch house stood damaged but intact, its windows shot out and walls pocked with bullet holes, but still providing shelter for the family that had defended it so successfully. The cost of victory was evident in wounded defenders and destroyed outbuildings, but the core objective, protecting Sarah Beth and baby James, had been achieved through courage and effective leadership under extreme pressure. The cleanup began immediately, with community volunteers arriving to assist with repairs and recovery efforts. Martha Peterson organized food for the defenders and medical supplies for the wounded, while her husband coordinated with local carpenters to begin repairing structural damage. The same community spirit that had supported the wedding celebration now contributed to rebuilding what violence had damaged. Dr. Henley worked through the night treating injuries that ranged from minor cuts to serious gunshot wounds, her kitchen, hospital, becoming a testament to frontier medicine's ability to preserve life under primitive conditions. Her efforts saved several men who might have died without immediate medical attention, earning gratitude that would last for generations. The physician's heroism during the battle became legendary throughout the region. Baby James had slept through much of the fighting, his innocent unconsciousness protecting him from trauma that might have affected his development permanently. Sarah Beth marveled at his ability to find peace amid chaos, interpreting his calm as evidence that children possessed wisdom about what truly mattered in life. His survival intact and healthy seemed almost miraculous, given the violence that had surrounded his first home. The wedding night that followed was unlike anything either Sarah Beth or Blackston could have imagined when they exchanged vows that morning, instead of romantic intimacy, they shared exhausted relief and profound gratitude for survival that created bonds deeper than passion alone could forge. They had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, their marriage consecrated by shared danger rather than conventional celebration. "We did it," Sarah Beth whispered as they sat together in the damaged but victorious house, baby James sleeping peacefully between them. "We protected our family and our home." Blackstone nodded, his arm around her shoulders, providing comfort that went beyond physical warmth to encompass emotional security earned through successful defense of everything they valued most. The legal consequences of the attack unfolded rapidly, with federal marshals arriving to investigate crimes that crossed territorial boundaries and involved interstate conspiracy. The evidence collected from captured attackers and their deceased leader revealed a network of business rivals who had pooled resources to eliminate Blackstone through violence when legal competition had failed to achieve their objectives. Judge Blackwood convened a special court session to hear evidence and issue warrants for arrests throughout Colorado Territory, his authority extending to crimes that threatened the stability of frontier communities. The legal proceedings that followed would establish precedents for prosecuting organized criminal conspiracies that targeted successful businessmen and their families. The community's response to the attack demonstrated how thoroughly Sarah Beth and Blackstone had been accepted as integral parts of Millbrook's social fabric. Neighbors who had initially viewed them with curiosity or suspicion now rallied with unconditional support, understanding that threats to one family endangered everyone's security. The attack had created unity that transcended previous social divisions. Reconstruction of the damaged ranch began within days, with improvements that would make future attacks virtually impossible while maintaining the property's character as a working ranch and family home. Blackstone's resources allowed for enhancements that included better defensive positions, improved communications with town, and facilities that would accommodate the larger workforce needed for expanded operations. The psychological impact of surviving such violence created changes that extended beyond physical improvements to include altered perspectives on life's priorities and values. Sarah Beth discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, while Blackstone learned that defending family could provide motivation stronger than business success or personal advancement. Baby James continued developing normally. Despite the traumatic circumstances of his early months, his resilience serving as a source of hope for parents who worried about long-term effects of the violence he had witnessed. Dr. Henley's regular examinations confirmed healthy growth and normal behavioral patterns, suggesting that love and security could overcome even the most difficult beginnings. The story of the Wedding Day battle spread throughout Colorado Territory, becoming a legend that inspired other families facing similar threats while warning criminals that frontier communities would defend themselves with deadly effectiveness when necessary. The tale grew in the telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. Good people could triumph over evil when they possessed courage and community support. Local women organized a second wedding celebration once repairs were completed, understanding that Sarah Beth deserved the peaceful ceremony she had been denied by criminal violence. The event was smaller but more intimate than originally planned, focusing on joy and gratitude rather than elaborate display. The community's gift to the couple was the restoration of normalcy after extraordinary circumstances. The arrival of spring's full flowering seemed symbolic of renewal and growth that extended beyond seasonal changes to encompass personal transformation and family development. The ranch land that had been scarred by battle began showing new growth, while the house repairs created improvements that made the property more beautiful than before the attack. Sarah Beth's role as Blackstone's wife evolved naturally from there. Partnership during the crisis, with responsibilities that included managing household affairs, contributing to business decisions, and representing the family in community activities. Her transformation from desperate widow to confident ranch wife demonstrated how circumstances could reveal hidden strengths when survival demanded adaptation. The first anniversary of Thomas Caldwell's death passed quietly, marked by private reflection rather than public mourning. Sarah Beth visited his grave with baby James, explaining to her son about the father he would never know while acknowledging how different their lives had become. The grief remained, but was tempered by gratitude for the security and love that had replaced uncertainty and fear. Blackstone's business interests expanded significantly following the successful defense of his family, with respect earned through combat leadership, attracting new partnerships and investment opportunities. His reputation for protecting what he valued made him an attractive ally for other businessmen who faced similar threats from criminal organizations seeking to profit through violence and intimidation. The captured attackers provided testimony that led to the dismantling of the conspiracy that had targeted the Blackstone family, with arrests and prosecutions extending throughout the region. The legal victory provided closure while establishing precedents that would protect other families from similar threats. Justice had been served through both immediate defense and subsequent legal action. Dr. Henley was offered positions in larger cities following her heroic performance during the battle, but chose to remain in Millbrook, where her skills were needed and appreciated. Her decision to stay reflected the same community loyalty that had motivated others to risk their lives defending the Blackstone family. The bonds forged during the crisis created lasting relationships that transcended professional obligations. As summer progressed toward autumn, the ranch achieved a prosperity and security that exceeded even Blackstone's optimistic projections when he had first purchased the property. The improvements forced by defensive necessities had created efficiencies that increased productivity while providing employment for local residents who contributed to the operation's success. Baby James took his first steps on the ranch's front porch, witnessed by parents whose joy was magnified by memories of how close they had come to losing everything they valued. His development into a healthy, happy toddler seemed to validate every sacrifice and risk they had accepted to build their life together. The child who'd been born into uncertainty now enjoyed security that would last his lifetime. The transformation of Sarah Beth from auctioned widow to prosperous ranch wife represented more than personal success. It demonstrated how frontier communities could nurture individual growth while protecting vulnerable members from exploitation. Her story became an inspiration for other women facing similar challenges, proving that courage and community support could overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. The love that had brought Sarah Beth and Blackstone together had been tested by violence and proven strong enough to survive any challenge that life might present. Their marriage had been forged in battle and tempered by shared danger, creating bonds that would endure through whatever future trials awaited them. They had found in each other not just romantic partners, but true companions, capable of facing any adversity together. As autumn painted the landscape in colors that rivaled the beauty of their wedding day, Sarah Beth stood on the ranch house porch holding baby James while watching Blackstone work with cattle in the distance. The scene represented everything they had fought to protect: family, home, security, and the freedom to build their own future according to their own values and dreams. The scars of battle remained visible on the ranch buildings and in memories that would never fully fade, but they served as reminders of strength discovered and challenges overcome rather than sources of ongoing fear. The family that had emerged from that crucible was stronger, closer, and more grateful for simple blessings than most people ever became. The story of their triumph over adversity would be told for generations, inspiring others who faced seemingly impossible odds, while demonstrating that love combined with courage could overcome any obstacle. They had not merely survived, they had prevailed, creating a legacy that would outlast their individual lives to benefit the community that had supported them when support was most needed. 5 years had passed since the morning when Sarah Beth Caldwell stood on an auction block, her life reduced to a commodity for sale to satisfy debts she hadn't created. Now, as she watched her son James chase chickens around the yard of their prosperous ranch, the distance between those two moments seemed immeasurable. The woman who had once been sold like livestock had become the matriarch of one of Colorado Territory's most respected families, her transformation serving as living proof that human dignity could triumph over any circumstance. The Blackstone Ranch had grown into an operation that employed 37 people, from experienced ranch hands to domestic staff, creating prosperity that rippled throughout Millbrook and the surrounding region. What had begun as an act of charity had evolved into a business empire that demonstrated how individual success could lift entire communities when guided by principles of fairness and mutual benefit. James Nathaniel Blackstone Jr., now a sturdy 5-year-old with his mother's gentle eyes and his adoptive father's determined chin, knew nothing of the auction that had nearly destroyed his future before he was born. To him, the ranch was simply home, a place where horses needed feeding, cattle required herding, and adults provided love and security without question. His innocence protected him from understanding the miracle of his own existence. Sarah Beth stood on the front porch, her second child growing within her as evidence of love that had conquered fear, watching James play with the casual confidence of a child who had never known want or uncertainty. The baby would arrive in autumn, a sibling whose birth would occur in circumstances so different from James's delivery that they might have belonged to different families entirely. The town of Millbrook had prospered alongside the Blackstone family, its growth fueled by the ranch's success and the investment opportunities that accompanied expanding operations. New businesses had opened to serve increased population, while existing establishments had enlarged their facilities to accommodate growing demand. The railroad station, once a simple depot, now boasted a proper terminal building that reflected the community's rising importance. Dr. Margaret Henley had married Sheriff Daniel Cray 2 years earlier, their wedding celebrated with joy that reflected the community's appreciation for their service during the crisis that had tested everyone's courage. Their union created a partnership that combined medical expertise with law enforcement experience, providing Millbrook with leadership capable of handling any challenge that frontier life might present. The physician sheriff's wife continued her medical practice while assuming new responsibilities as the region's senior law enforcement official's spouse. Her combination of professional competence and personal bravery had inspired other women to pursue careers beyond traditional domestic roles, contributing to social changes that extended far beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Emil Kruger had surprised everyone by developing his barbershop into the territory's first newspaper, the Millbrook Herald, which documented local events while connecting the community to broader developments throughout the American West. His writing combined Germanic precision with frontier directness, creating journalism that informed readers while entertaining them with stories that captured the region's unique character. The newspaper's coverage of the Blackstone Ranch attack had been reprinted throughout Colorado Territory and neighboring states, making the story famous beyond its immediate locality. The account had become required reading in Eastern schools, where children learned about frontier courage, while inspiring legislation that strengthened law enforcement's ability to prosecute organized criminal conspiracies. Martha and Robert Peterson, had expanded their general store into a commercial enterprise that supplied ranches throughout a three-county area, their success built on relationships established during years of honest dealing and community service. Their business growth demonstrated how individual integrity could create prosperity that benefited everyone involved, from suppliers to customers to the broader community. Mrs. Henrietta Walsh had retired from operating the boarding house, selling the establishment to Dr. Henley and Sheriff Cray, who converted it into a combination residence and medical clinic that served the region's growing population. Her retirement was comfortable due to investments that Blackstone had recommended, proving that loyalty and discretion were virtues that practical men rewarded generously. The boarding house's transformation symbolized Millbrook's evolution from a rough frontier settlement into an established community where families could prosper and children could grow up safely. The changes reflected prosperity that extended beyond material wealth to include social stability and cultural development that attracted new residents while retaining existing families. Judge Harrison Blackwood had established permanent residence in Millbrook, recognizing that the community's growth required consistent legal services rather than periodic visits from traveling courts. His decision reflected confidence in the region's future while providing the stable legal framework necessary for continued development and investment. The courthouse that had once hosted Sarah Beth's humiliation now served as headquarters for a legal system that protected property rights while ensuring that justice remained accessible to all residents regardless of economic status. The building's expansion included facilities for record-keeping and legal research that supported the complex transactions accompanying territorial development. Reverend Samuel Pierce had overseen the construction of a new church building, larger and more elaborate than the original structure, funded by donations from prosperity that the community's growth had generated. The sanctuary's stained glass windows, imported from St. Louis, cast colored light that transformed Sunday services into celebrations of gratitude for blessings that extended beyond spiritual salvation. The church's expansion reflected not just increased membership, but deeper commitment to faith that adversity had strengthened rather than weakened. The congregation that had once struggled to support basic operations now contributed to missionary work and charitable activities that extended Christian service throughout the territory. The railroad had expanded its service to include daily passenger trains and twice-weekly freight service, connecting Millbrook to markets and opportunities that had been unimaginable when the community was isolated by distance and primitive transportation. The improved connections had brought new residents, while enabling existing businesses to reach customers throughout the region. The depot's expansion included telegraph service that provided immediate communication with distant cities, eliminating the isolation that had once made frontier communities vulnerable to both natural disasters and human threats. Information could now travel faster than horsemen, creating security through knowledge and connectivity that criminal organizations couldn't disrupt easily. Educational opportunities had expanded with the arrival of Miss Eleanor Whitman's replacement, a married couple from Ohio who brought advanced pedagogical training and enough teachers to divide students by age and ability. The new school building, constructed with Blackstone family funding, provided facilities that rivaled those found in much larger communities. The educational improvements reflected an understanding that frontier communities needed intellectual development as well as economic growth to attract and retain families who possessed choices about where to live. Children who received quality education would become adults capable of leadership and innovation that would sustain prosperity through changing circumstances. Sarah Beth had established a library in the school building, donating books from her personal collection while organizing fundraising efforts that brought additional volumes from Eastern publishers. Her involvement in educational activities demonstrated how women could contribute to community development through volunteer service that complemented their domestic responsibilities. The library's collection included both practical manuals that helped residents improve their farming and ranching techniques and literary works that provided entertainment and cultural education. The facility served as a community center where people gathered for lectures, discussions, and social events that strengthened bonds between neighbors. The women's auxiliary organizations that had formed around church and school activities had evolved into influential groups that addressed social needs while providing outlets for female leadership and civic participation. Their projects included charitable work, cultural events, and advocacy for improvements that enhanced family life and community welfare. Sarah Beth's leadership in these organizations reflected her transformation from isolated widow to community matriarch whose opinions carried weight in decisions that affected everyone's future. Her ability to bridge social divisions between established families and newcomers made her particularly effective in building consensus around controversial issues. The economic development that had accompanied the Blackstone Ranch's success had attracted attention from territorial and federal officials who recognized Millbrook as an example of how Western communities could achieve stability and prosperity. Government investments in infrastructure and services reflected confidence that the region would continue growing and contributing to national development. The mail service had been upgraded to daily delivery, with routes that connected Millbrook to the territorial capital and major commercial centers. The improved postal service facilitated business communications while helping families maintain connections with relatives in distant locations, reducing the social isolation that had once characterized frontier life. Banking services had expanded beyond Jonathan Harwick's original institution to include a savings and loan association that provided financing for home construction and business development. The additional financial services reflected both increased wealth and confidence in the community's long-term prospects that encouraged investment in permanent improvements. The Blackstone family's philanthropy had funded numerous community improvements, from the school building to church expansions to infrastructure projects that benefited everyone regardless of their ability to contribute financially. Their generosity demonstrated how individual success could serve broader social purposes when guided by conscience and community commitment. James Blackstone Sr. had been elected to the territorial legislature, his campaign supported by voters who appreciated his business success and community service while trusting his judgment on issues that affected the region's development. His political involvement reflected duty to use influence responsibly rather than personal ambition for power or recognition. The legislative service required frequent travel to the territorial capital, separating him from family for weeks at a time, but Sarah Beth supported his public service while managing ranch operations with competence that impressed business associates and political allies. Her ability to handle complex responsibilities independently demonstrated how partnership could strengthen both spouses rather than limiting either one's potential. The political connections that accompanied legislative service had brought additional business opportunities while providing influence that protected the region's interests during territorial development negotiations. The family's success had created resources and relationships that benefited the entire community through favorable legislation and government investment. Dr. Henley's medical practice had evolved to include surgical procedures that previously required travel to Denver or other distant cities, her skills enhanced by continuing education that kept her current with medical advances. The improved healthcare reduced infant mortality while extending life expectancy for residents who had once faced death from treatable conditions. The medical improvements reflected not just individual physician competence, but community investment in health services that attracted new residents while retaining existing families. The availability of quality healthcare had become a factor in business location decisions that brought prosperity and employment to the region. Sheriff Cray's law enforcement organization had expanded to include deputy sheriffs stationed in surrounding communities, creating a network of professional officers who could respond rapidly to threats while maintaining order during the social changes that accompanied rapid growth. The improved law enforcement had reduced crime while increasing confidence in property rights that encouraged investment. The law enforcement improvements had been funded partly through Blackstone family contributions and partly through tax revenues that reflected increased property values and business activity. The community's willingness to invest in public safety demonstrated understanding that security was a prerequisite for continued prosperity and development. Baby James had grown into a confident child whose education included private tutoring that supplemented public school instruction, preparing him for leadership responsibilities that would accompany inheritance of the family's business interests. His development reflected advantages that prosperity could provide while being tempered by values that emphasized service and responsibility rather than privilege and entitlement. The child's innocence about his origins protected him from burden, while ensuring that he understood the importance of helping others who faced difficulties beyond their control. His parents had decided to wait until he reached maturity before explaining the circumstances of his birth and the auction that had nearly destroyed his future. Sarah Beth's second pregnancy proceeded smoothly, supported by Dr. Henley's expert care and the security that eliminated stress and worry from her daily life. The approaching birth represented joy rather than anxiety, reflecting how circumstances could transform similar events from traumatic ordeals into celebratory milestones. The gender remained unknown, but preparations had been made for either possibility, with clothing and nursery arrangements that reflected love and anticipation rather than mere practical necessity. The baby would enter a world where his or her welfare was assured and future opportunities were unlimited by economic circumstances or social prejudice. As autumn approached, bringing with it the anniversary of so many significant events in their family history, Sarah Beth reflected on the journey that had transformed her from desperate widow to cherished wife and mother. The path had included suffering that had seemed unbearable at the time, but it had led to happiness that exceeded her most optimistic dreams. The ranch house where she now lived bore little resemblance to the empty shell she had occupied after Thomas's death, its rooms filled with laughter and conversation that made every space feel alive with purpose and meaning. The additions and improvements reflected not just increased wealth, but deeper understanding of what made a house into a home. Standing on the porch, where she had once watched strangers examine her husband's possessions before the auction, Sarah Beth marveled at the transformation that had occurred in both her circumstances and her character. The woman who had once felt powerless against forces beyond her control had discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to riders coming up the road from town, their pace suggesting routine business rather than emergency. James Blackstone Sr. was returning from his latest legislative session, accompanied by associates whose presence indicated successful conclusion of negotiations that would benefit the region's continued development. Baby James ran to meet his father with excitement that transformed the homecoming into a celebration of family bonds that had been strengthened rather than weakened by temporary separations. The child's joy reminded everyone present that love was the foundation upon which all other achievements were built. As her husband dismounted and swept their son into his arms, Sarah Beth felt the baby move within her, as if responding to the happiness that surrounded them. The new life, preparing to join their family, would inherit not just material prosperity, but also values and relationships that money could never purchase. The evening meal that followed brought together family, friends, and business associates, in conversation that ranged from territorial politics to ranch management to community development, with every topic touched by awareness that individual success created responsibilities to contribute to broader welfare. Their prosperity had meaning beyond personal satisfaction because it enabled service to others who faced challenges they had overcome. Later that night, as Sarah Beth and her husband sat on the porch watching stars that seemed brighter than ever before, they reflected on the journey that had brought them together and the future that awaited their growing family. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding that transcended words. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I hadn't been at that auction?" James asked, his voice carrying wonder rather than worry about alternative possibilities. Sarah Beth smiled, her hand resting on her belly where new life grew. "I think about what did happen instead, how love found a way to triumph over circumstances that should have destroyed us." The baby kicked as if agreeing with her assessment, reminding them both that miracles could emerge from situations that appeared hopeless when viewed through eyes clouded by fear and despair. Their story had become proof that human dignity could survive any trial when supported by courage, compassion, and community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, as every day did for people who chose growth over safety and service over selfishness. But tonight, they were content to sit in peaceful gratitude for blessings that exceeded anything they had dared imagine during their darkest hours. The stars above them shone with light that had traveled impossible distances to reach Earth, reminding them that hope could survive any journey when it carried truth worth preserving. Their love had been tested by forces that might have destroyed weaker foundations, but it had emerged stronger and more valuable than anything that wealth alone could purchase. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like earthbound stars, each representing families whose lives had been touched by the prosperity and security that community cooperation could create. The town that had once been just a stop along the railroad had become home to people who understood that individual success meant nothing without neighbors to share it with. As they prepared to go inside, Sarah Beth paused for one last look at the landscape that had witnessed so much transformation. The land itself seemed to glow with contentment, as if the earth itself appreciated being stewarded by people who understood that ownership created obligations rather than just privileges. The house that welcomed them was filled with warmth that went beyond mere temperature to encompass love, security, and hope for the future. Baby James slept peacefully in his bed, his dreams undisturbed by knowledge of the struggles that had been necessary to secure his happiness. Soon, there would be another child sleeping in the nursery, another life that would grow up surrounded by advantages that had been purchased through courage and sacrifice rather than simply inherited. The legacy they were creating would extend far beyond material inheritance to include values and relationships that could enrich generations yet unborn. Their story had begun with desperation and humiliation, circumstances that might have justified bitterness and defeat. Instead, it had become a testament to the power of love, to transform suffering into strength, isolation into community, and despair into hope that could light the way for others facing similar darkness. The woman who had once been sold at auction had become priceless, not because of the wealth she had married into, but because of the character she had revealed under pressure and the love she had both received and given without reservation. Her true value could never be measured in dollars because it resided in qualities that money could neither buy nor destroy. As they closed the door on another day in their remarkable journey together, Sarah Beth and James knew that their greatest achievements lay not in the prosperity they had accumulated, but in the lives they had touched and the example they had set for others who needed proof that tomorrow could be better than today. The auction block where it all began had long since been removed from the courthouse square, replaced by a monument honoring territorial pioneers whose courage had built communities where families could prosper and children could grow up safely. But its lesson remained. Human dignity could not be bought or sold, only recognized and cherished by those wise enough to understand its true worth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.